Good morning. I am Randy Fiorini, the Vice Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, and I would like to welcome each and every one of you to this morning's meeting. I officially call this meeting to order and begin with establishing a quorum, beginning with the far right.
Weinberg, present.
Gatto, present.
Fiorini here. Very good. We have a quorum. The first item on the agenda today is a public hearing and consideration of proposed findings regarding the appeal of the certification of consistency for the Smith Canal Gate project. Let the record reflect that it is 10:03 on Thursday, March 21st, 2019, and we are here today at the University Plaza Waterfront Hotel at 110 West Fremont Street in Stockton, California. We are here for a public hearing to receive comments on the determination, which contains findings regarding the appeal of the certification of consistency for the Smith Canal Gate project. Following this hearing, we anticipate adopting a determination with findings that either deny the appeal or remand the certification of consistency for the Smith Canal Gate project back to the San Joaquin Area Flood Control Agency for reconsideration. Before we begin, I have a few general announcements. First, please look around now and identify the exits closest to you. Should an alarm sound, we will be required to evacuate this room immediately. In that event, please take your valuables with you. Second, the bathrooms are located out the doors and down the hallway to the left. And last, please silence your cell phones or other devices now. I'll now ask council staff to provide a staff report for this item. Following the staff report, I will provide additional information regarding how the parties and the public may address the council on this item.
Thank you, Vice Chair Fiorini. My name is Jeff Henderson. I'm Deputy Executive Officer for Planning for the Council, and I'll be joined this morning by Aaron Mullen, Maggie Christman, and Avery Livengood to present the staff report presentation on Smith Canal. May we have the PowerPoint, please? Thank you. By way of presentation this morning, we'll outline the Council's covered action authority and process and how that originates from the Delta Reform Act. We'll then summarize the staff report that's been presented to the Council and the proposed determination regarding the appeal of certification of consistency for the Smith Canal Gate project. We'll then summarize our staff analysis and recommendations to the Council, and at the conclusion of the presentation, staff will recommend that the Council adopt the proposed determination, and the proposed determination contains findings that would deny the appeal. With regard to the Council's covered action authority, the statutory authority for the Council to review covered actions originates from the 2009 Delta Reform Act, which is the state of California's policy describing how the state would like to achieve the co-equal goals that are established for the Delta, namely providing water supply reliability, providing for ecosystem restoration, and doing both in a manner that enhances Delta as a place. The Delta Plan is then the document that establishes the Council's regulatory policies to meet the objectives that the legislature identified were inherent in the co-equal goals for the Delta. And the Covered Action Authority is also granted to the Council via the Delta Reform Act. And under that authority, state and local agencies are required to demonstrate consistency with the Delta Plan's regulatory policies when they propose to carry out, to approve, or to fund covered actions prior to implementation. When an agency identifies that a project they're pursuing is a covered action, the means to identify consistency with the Delta Plan is through filing of a certification of consistency with the Council. And in its certification, a proponent would determine first if a project is a covered action, and then would submit that certification to the Council. Upon receipt, the Council publicly notices the receipt of that certification and then reviews written certification that's been provided by the project proponent, presenting detailed findings concerning the consistency certification. In its certification, a proponent typically will provide background and descriptive information about the project, will offer findings related to each Delta Plan policy that's implicated by the certification, will cite to portions of the record provided as substantial evidence to support the certification, and again, we make all of the certifications of consistency received by the Council available on the Council's website. Following a certification, any person who claims that a covered action would be inconsistent with the Delta Plan has the ability to file an appeal within 30 days of certification. That appeal must include specific factual allegations describing the alleged inconsistency, and those specific factual allegations are what define how the Council considers the appeal. Certifications and appeals are both, again, publicly noticed and available and listed on the Council's website. Once an appeal is received, the Council then must conduct a hearing on an appeal within 60 days of filing. And you may recall that the Council conducted a hearing on this matter at its January 2019 meeting. Following the hearing, the Council must make a decision regarding the appeal within 60 days of the hearing, thus our presence at the March meeting to consider the proposed determination. And again, as indicated in Vice Chair Fiorini's opening comments, the Council essentially has two options under Water Code Section 85225.25. One, to deny the appeal, under which case the project may proceed, or two, to remand the project back to the proponent for reconsideration. And it should be noted on appeal, failure on one policy, failure to demonstrate consistency on one policy would result in a remand for the full project. Under review, the Council's scope of review is governed by the substantial evidence standard, and thus the Council's scope of review is whether or not the certification filed by the proponent is supported by substantial evidence in the record. And substantial evidence consists essentially of facts, reasonable assumptions based upon facts, and expert opinions supported by facts. The Council does not independently review the project to determine if it's consistent with the Delta Plan. There's a fairly precise frame for the Council's analysis and findings based on the project as it's submitted by the proponent, issues that are raised on the appeal, and substantial evidence in the record. I'm now going to turn it over to Erin, who's going to summarize the project description for you.
Thank you, Jeff. I have a little bit of a cold this morning, so I hope that I can be legible as I speak. I'm going to start with a brief project description. The proposed project consists of a fixed wall and gate structure at the mouth of Smith Canal and Atherton Cove along the San Joaquin River across from the Deepwater Ship Channel in Stockton, California. Oh, thank you. According to the certification, the project is required for flood protection. The certification can be found on the Council's website. Next slide. As described in the certification, the purpose of the project is to provide 100-year level of flood protection for an urbanized area of Stockton, shown here on the left in gray. SEJFCA is also working towards providing a larger area with 200-year flood protection, shown on the right in red. This slide is an illustration of the proposed project. You can see Atherton Cove at the top, and Smith Canal extends back and to the right. The proposed project would consist of a fixed cellular sheet pile wall, seen here in green, with a 50-foot wide gate structure, shown here in blue. Next slide. The Delta Plan has 17 regulatory policies, 14 standalone, and GP1 has 4 parts. In SJFCA's certification, it found that 5 of the 17 policies were consistent, and 11 of the policies were not applicable for the project. Next slide. The sole appeal received before the cutoff date was submitted by Atherton Cove Property Owners Association, or ACPOA. The appeal contends that SJFCA failed to demonstrate substantial evidence within the record to support consistency with aspects of GP1B2, mitigation measures, GP1B3, best available science, GP1B4, adaptive management, and ERP5, invasive non-native species. The appeal is also available on the Council's website. Next slide. I'm going to go over the timeline, basically kind of outline what has brought us here today. On November 2nd, 2018, the Council received certification of consistency for the Smith Canal Gate project from SJFCA. On December 3rd, 2018, an appeal was filed by ACPOA. On December 13th, 2018, SJFCA certified the record as full and complete. On January 24th, 2019, the Council held the first of 2 hearings on this project. On February 21st, 2019, the Council provided notice of today's hearing, the second of 2 hearings, and released the staff-prepared draft determination for public review. On February 28, 2019, the Council received comments on the staff-prepared draft determination from the parties and interested persons. And on March 14th, 2019, the Council released the proposed determination for review and discussion at today's hearing. This slide shows the summary of the staff proposed determination. Please note that they are presented in slightly different order by outcome than they are in your staff report. Staff recommends that the Council find that 1 policy does not apply, and that for the other 3 policies, staff recommends denying the appeals. Staff recommends that the appellant fails to demonstrate lack of substantial evidence in the record to support SJFCA's certification. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, who will discuss the proposed findings in more detail.
Thank you, Erin. So for the balance of our presentation, for each policy, we'll describe briefly SJFCA's certification, key appeal issues, the staff analysis, and staff's recommended conclusion or finding. The first of these policies is policy GP1B4, which is one of the 4 detailed findings all covered actions must comply with. The issue regarding GP1B4 is that the appellant contends that because the project would alter water flows, hydrology, invasive species, or other factors that would affect aquatic habitat in the Delta, it falls within the definition of a water management project. And why that's potentially important is because both water management projects and ecosystem restoration projects are required to prepare an adaptive management plan in order to comply with GP1B4. The staff analysis on this issue consisted of an extensive review of the Delta Reform Act and the Delta Plan regulations. And in looking at those 2 pieces of information, it's clear that flood control projects were identified as a discrete or separate project category in the development of the Delta Reform Act, in the development of the Delta Plan, and thus, based on those pieces of information, are inherently separate project categories. And policy GP1B4 does not apply to flood control projects. And so based on this determination and analysis, staff's recommended conclusion is that the Council need not consider the applicability of GP1B4 to the Smith Canal Gate project because the Smith Canal Gate project is a flood control project rather than a water management project. I'll now turn it over to Avery to summarize our approach to GP1B2.
Thank you, Jeff. Subpolicy GP1B2 requires that covered actions that are subject to CEQA include applicable mitigation measures from the Delta Plan Program EIR or substitute equivalent measures. Where the facts of a covered action show that a project will be designed, constructed, and operated such that significant environmental impacts will not occur, there is no obligation to mitigate, and therefore the corresponding Delta Plan mitigation measures are not applicable. Delta Plan Mitigation Measure 4-1 requires an invasive species management plan for projects that could introduce or facilitate invasive species establishment. SJAFCA proposes a water hyacinth control program as a part of the Smith Canal Gate project, as a project element. The appellant contends that the water hyacinth control program is not equally or more effective than Delta Plan Mitigation Measure 4-1. The staff analysis finds that Delta Plan Mitigation Measure 4-1 does not apply to the water hyacinth impacts of the project because the final EIR did not identify any significant water hyacinth impacts. Therefore, we conclude that the appellant failed to show that there is not substantial evidence to support the certification with regard to Delta Plan Mitigation Measure 4-1. Turning to Mitigation Measures 4-2 and 4-3, the appellant contends that SJAFCA fails to avoid or mitigate operational impacts to special status fish species from increased predation that could result from altered flows as required by Delta Plan Mitigation Measure 4-2. The appellant also contends that SJAFCA fails to avoid or mitigate operational impacts to fish habitat as required by Delta Plan Mitigation Measure 4-3. Once again, where the facts of a specific covered action show that the project will be designed, constructed, and operated such that significant environmental impacts will not occur, there is no obligation to mitigate, and the corresponding Delta Plan measures are not applicable. So the staff analysis finds that Delta Plan Mitigation Measure 4-2 does not apply to the project because the final EIR does not identify potentially significant operational impacts on special status fish species. And similarly, Delta Plan Mitigation Measure 4-3 does not apply to the project because the EIR does not identify potentially significant operational impacts to fish habitat. We conclude that the appellant failed to show that there is not substantial evidence to support the certification with regard to mitigation measures 4-2 and 4-3. And so the proposed determination recommends denying the appeal with regard to subpolicy GP1B2. Maggie Chrisman will now present on policies GP1B3 and ERP5.
Thank you, Avery. Policy GP1B3 requires all covered actions to document the use of best available science as relevant to the purpose and nature of the project. Delta Plan Appendix 1A provides guidance and descriptions for 6 criteria of best available science. These include relevance, inclusiveness, objectivity, transparency and openness, timeliness, and peer review. The appellant here contends that SJAFCA failed to demonstrate compliance with the GP1B3's best available science criteria of relevance and inclusiveness on 2 issues. In this context, relevance means scientific information should be pertinent to the Delta ecosystem or other components and processes affected by proposed decisions. Inclusiveness means scientific information should incorporate a thorough review of relevant information and analyses across disciplines. The appellant contends that SJAFCA improperly relies on residents' time to analyze water quality impacts and that they fail to analyze cyanobacteria proliferation. The staff analysis finds that the appellant fails to explain how SJAFCA does not meet these criteria. With respect to the issue of residence time and modeling, the appellant does not explain why limitations of hydrodynamic modeling, such as using residence time as a surrogate for water quality parameters and the use of mid-channel locations in the modeling, make the analysis inconsistent with the relevance and inclusiveness criteria. For the issue of cyanobacteria proliferation, the appellant does not explain how arguments provided in the appeal demonstrate SJAFCA's failure to meet relevance and inclusiveness criteria. So in conclusion, the appellant fails to show that there is not substantial evidence to support SJAFCA certification, and the proposed determination recommends denying the appeal related to GP1B3. For policy ERP5, the requirement is that potential introductions of or improved habitat conditions for invasive non-native species be fully considered and avoided or mitigated in a way that appropriately protects the ecosystem. The appellant contends that SJAFCA did not fully consider and avoid or mitigate the potential for new introductions of or improved habitat conditions for water hyacinth and invasive predatory fish species. The staff analysis finds that the appellant fails to demonstrate that SJAFCA does not fully consider and avoid improved habitat conditions for water hyacinth. The project includes a water hyacinth control program with identified performance standards to maintain existing conditions. The appellant also fails to demonstrate that SJAFCA does not fully consider the potential for the project to increase habitat for invasive fish. For example, project design changes and potential effects of altered flows are included in the analysis of predation impacts to special status species and are described in the CEQA addendum. In conclusion, the appellant fails to show that there is not substantial evidence to support SJAFCA certification, and the proposed determination recommends denying the appeal related to ERP5.
Thank you, Maggie. And so by way of conclusion, the staff analysis and the proposed determination identifies that the appellant fails to show that there is not substantial evidence in the record to support the certification with respect to 4 policies: GP1B2, detailed findings for mitigation measures; GP1B3, detailed findings related to best available science; and ERP5, non-native invasive species. Additionally, staff recommends a determination that policy GP1B4, detailed findings related to adaptive management, does not apply to the project. And for these 4 reasons, staff recommends that the council deny the appeal pursuant to Water Code Section 85225.25 as described in the proposed determination attached to your staff report. Staff also recommends council adoption of that determination. That concludes the staff report, and we are happy to respond to any questions.
Jeff, Aaron, Avery, Maggie, thank you. To those representing SJAFCA, the appellant, homeowners group, and members of the public here today to comment on the Smith Canal Gate project, here are some important instructions. Commenters speaking today will not be sworn in. This entire hearing will be recorded by a certified court reporter. The rough transcript of the hearing and all written materials presented during the hearing will be shared with the service list and posted on the Council's Smith Canal website in approximately 2 weeks. If you're interested in purchasing final transcripts from the reporters in the interim, please coordinate with them directly. Our court reporter is seated here to your right. The company name and contact information is L.J. Hart & Associates, Incorporated, at 916-922-9001. We will hear first from SJAFCA, followed by the appellant. Each of the parties will be allowed a total of 20 minutes for oral presentation. Upon completion of all presentations, we will then commence with public comment. Council members, I encourage you to hold your questions for the party speaking until the conclusion of each presentation. At that point, I will announce the opportunity for council member questions before proceeding on to the next party. Once party presentations have ended, any members of the public who want to provide public comment will be allowed 3 minutes for oral presentation. Additional time will be allowed for questions by the council members or council staff. If you want to provide public comment and are not a speaker on behalf of SJAFCA or the appellant, we ask that you fill out a blue speaker card. You can find that at the staff table to your right. These public comments will be heard in the order we received the completed blue speaker cards. In order to allow everyone an opportunity to speak, we may shorten the time limit for speakers during the public comment portion of the hearing. If we do so, I will announce it prior to the beginning of the portion of the hearing. After we hear from everyone who has filled out a blue speaker card, we will close the public comment portion of this hearing. Finally, when you come to speak, we ask that you do a couple of things so that the council, audience, and the court reporter may hear you, so that your comments are entered into the record and can be responded to appropriately. First, speak into the microphone, and second, please begin by stating your name and identifying the organization you represent, if any. We will now begin with the party presentations, beginning with the San Joaquin Area Flood Control Agency. Looks like we have a question.
Yeah, can the public ask questions of the staff prior to the presentation?
You'll be provided an opportunity. Fill out a blue speaker card, and we'll give you.
Can we ask questions, or is that part of our 3 minutes?
That'll be part of your 3 minutes.
They'll answer the questions during the 3 minutes?
If they feel like it, yes.
Having some technical difficulties with the clock. If you come back a few minutes, there's 20-minute clock.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Bethany, I'll keep track of it.
All right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Catherine Olschlager. I'm here on behalf of SJAFCA. I will be brief. I wanted to thank staff for what was obviously an incredible amount of work in a very short period of time to put together the draft determination. I don't really think there's anything for me to add at this point, given the detail in that document and my presentation at the prior meeting, but I did want to offer the opportunity for the council to ask me questions. I also have my technical team here if there are questions on the engineering or environmental issues. All right.
It appears there.
So, I do have a question if I could, Mr. Chair. Just at the last public hearing that we had, one of the questions that surfaced for me was, in terms of just the public being able to understand how the non-invasive species monitoring plan is going to be rolled out, or how folks can access it or view or see what it looks like, because that's a concern that I think was expressed. What's the process for that, or what should folks expect who are unfamiliar with a lot of the systems that are in place to manage it, but the layperson who wants to understand it a little bit more?
Sure. So I think you're referring to the Water Hyacinth Management Program that will be developed. That is a part of the operations and maintenance program for the gate, which is under development now. The EIR did include benchmarks that laid out essentially what will be done. There will be visual inspection conducted, and that was a publicly circulated document. Visual inspection and monitoring, and then mechanical removal on regular intervals. In terms of the operations and maintenance program, that will likely be adopted at a public meeting, but I might present that to our staff, whether that will be something that is noticed on an agenda for SJAFCA. Okay. This is Chris Elias, the Executive Director of SJAFCA, just confirming that that document will be subject to a publicly noticed meeting at SJAFCA's board.
Great, thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. Hearing nothing else, we'll rest. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So next up is the appellant, the Atherton Cove Homeowners Association, represented by Mr. Solari. Good morning.
Good morning, all. Ms. Olschlager finished a lot quicker than I was expecting, so I need to set up a little bit if that's okay. So I will actually be much more brief also than the prior presentation. And I'm really, pardon me, I'm Patrick Solari on behalf of the appellant, Atherton Cove Property Owners Association, ACPOA. So I'm going to focus pretty much just on the water hyacinth issue, and specifically the policy GP1B2, which requires any covered action to be equally or more effective than the Delta Plan's mitigations. And the relevant portion of the mitigation measures, Delta Plan mitigation measures that we're talking about, is mitigation measure 4-1, and it's just a portion of that deals with invasive species. And I'm just going to read a few passages from it. It says, the plan, the invasive species plan, the plan shall be based on best available science and developed in consultation with Department of Fish and Wildlife and local experts. So that right there, that's a substantive requirement for the plan to be developed in consultation with these folks. Now, you saw the presentation back in January where it was generally described in the final EIR as having this 20% cover trigger due to visual inspections. But nowhere in the record is there any attempt to suggest that any of this plan, which again hasn't actually been developed yet, and SJAFCA concedes that at this point, and even the staff findings suggest that. Nowhere is there any indication that any of these components were actually based upon consultation with experts, right? And then let's just go on. It says the invasive species management plan will include the following methods: non-native species eradication methods, if eradication is feasible. No discussion whether eradication is feasible within Atherton Cove. Non-native species management methods, including early detection methods. What are the early detection methods here? And how was that done in consultation? Again, there's nothing in the record that indicates any of these bullet points from mitigation measure 4-1 were actually satisfied by the general discussion in the final EIR. So as a result of the fact that there's really no facts supporting compliance with mitigation measure 4.1, the draft findings essentially come up with two purely legal arguments. One, that the entire policy itself, GP1B2, isn't even applicable to water hyacinth because this yet to be developed plan isn't actually a mitigation measure, it's a design feature of the project. And then secondly, there's a suggestion that, well, there's actually nothing requiring the development of the plan before this consistency determination. So again, both of those are just a purely legal attempt to sidestep the factual requirements of the policy requiring compliance with the Delta plan. And I'm going to take each one in fairly close detail. So with respect to this issue of whether the invasive species, the water hyacinth plan is mitigation or element of the project. The CEQA law, and again, we're talking about CEQA here. I looked, even again last night, I looked to see if mitigation measures were defined in either the Delta Plan regulations, or the Delta Reform Act, and it's not. So, unfortunately, while, because we talk in terms of mitigation, we need to actually look at CEQA law for what's mitigation. And there's a case directly on point, and it's Lotus versus Department of Transportation, which we've cited repeatedly. And it says, quote, invasive plant removal is, quote, plainly mitigation measure and not part of the project itself. So again, we have to look at CEQA law on this issue of project component versus mitigation. The published case law is unequivocal. Nobody suggests Lotus is wrongly decided. There's no other cases that directly address this issue. Lotus is not addressed in the findings. Now, in the most recent version of the findings, which were released a week ago, and again, I'll just take a step back, we provided a comment letter on February 28th in response to the draft preliminary findings, and then in response to our February 28th letter a week ago, a subsequent red line set of findings. And in red line, the findings state the following, and again, I'm going to quote, mitigation also is not required if measures are included in the project to reduce significant impacts, end quote. And then it cites CEQA guidelines 15126.4. That is just absolutely an incorrect statement of the law. And so I've actually got my little handy dandy CEQA book here. And the referenced, so again, the staff findings say mitigation is also not required if measures are included in the project to reduce significant impacts. What the reference section actually says is, again, in a section entitled mitigation measures, it says, quote, the discussion of mitigation measures shall distinguish between the measures which are proposed by project proponents to be included in the project and other measures proposed by the lead, responsible, or trustee agency or other persons which are not included in the, but the lead agency determines could be reasonably be expected to reduce adverse impacts. This discussion shall identify mitigation measures for each significant environmental impact. So it simply does not support staff's characterization. What it does support is they're all mitigation measures. Whether they're mitigation measures proposed by the project applicant, here SJAFCA, or whether they're mitigation measures proposed by a lead agency or responsible agency or trustee agency, whatever. They're all mitigation measures, and they all require discussion. And if there was any question about this interpretation, subdivision A2 of that same CEQA guideline states, quote, mitigation measures can be incorporated into the plan, policy, regulation, or project design, end quote. So to somehow suggest that this invasive species plan is not mitigation because it's a part of the project is just contrary to CEQA law, which is what we have to look at here. But it also has an incredibly, I think, harmful effect on this body's authority to review projects. Because if, this is I think the second hearing, and there's going to be further projects, there's going to be further consistency determinations. If this council decides that GP1B2 is completely inapplicable just because the agency characterizes their actions as a design feature of the project and not mitigation measure, that is going to create an exception that swallows the whole. And this body will not, there may be projects coming before this body that are more sympathetic than maybe a flood control project. But because the mitigation measures have been incorporated into the project design, this decision sets a precedent that, hey, we cannot enforce the Delta Plan mitigation measures, which are actually pretty good. They're pretty strong, they're pretty effective. But they're totally obviated, all because the agency simply is recharacterizing mitigation as a design feature of the project. And that's just a very troubling policy perspective. Now, the findings also go on to state, and this is page 11 of the red line findings, talking about the water hyacinth control plan, and again, the fact that there's no facts to support consistency with mitigation 4.1. And again, I'm just going to read and this was a new section, again, red line a week ago. Quote, but the appellant has not identified any provision of GP1B2 or the associated Delta Plan measures that prohibit the formulation of the water hyacinth control program at a later date. Delta Plan measures 4-1 require the development and implementation of an invasive species management plan before construction or operation of the project, but does not otherwise specify a time frame for development of the plan. So not only is that legally incorrect, but it's just not logical. The requirement to have the plan prior to the consistency determination is built into the requirement for substantial evidence review. If there's no plan, there's nothing in the record for this body to determine that it's consistent with mitigation measure 4-1. It's like asking a teacher to give me an A on my essay, but saying, well, teacher, nothing says I was supposed to actually submit the essay before you give me the A. It's built into the framework. If there is no plan, and again, this is an alternative argument. This is a new alternative argument which assumes that GP1B2 applies. It says, well, that can be deferred after the consistency determination is made. How is it possible for this body to determine that the invasive species management plan satisfies all the substantive factual requirements of mitigation measure 4.1 if it doesn't have the plan before it? But again, just legally and logically it doesn't make sense. But again, it also sets up another huge problem for this body's authority looking forward. Future project applicants will simply say, hey, you know what, that's deferred into the future, we'll take care of it, don't worry. And there's now precedent from this body which indicates that's okay. So both of these completely legal, kind of concocted legal arguments to avoid the factual argument of whether the non-existent invasive species program complies with mitigation measure 4-1, these completely legal arguments are setting up this council for real problems going forward. And there's a way to avoid it, right? I mean, there's been extensive litigation over the Delta plan, and that my firm's been involved in, and one of the consistent themes is that the Delta plan is not strong enough to actually protect the Delta. Well, one of the rule policies that are actually one of the stronger policies and really effective is the requirement to be equally or more effective than the Delta plan's mitigation measures. And by adopting these draft findings, this body is, it's simply eliminating that as a viable regulatory oversight tool for this body. So it's taking away another one of the arrows in your quiver to actually protect the Delta. And so what are we talking about here? We're talking about an invasive species management plan. It can be done, right? If this body determines, as I would ask it to do, that these legal arguments should not be made, that this body should actually consider whether the presently non-existent plan satisfies mitigation measure 4-1. It should conclude the plan doesn't yet exist. We need the plan to exist before we can make a consistency determination. So remand it back to SJAFCA to prepare the plan. I have no doubt that Ms. Olschlager would move heaven and earth to get that plan prepared in a month or 2 months, that SJAFCA could turn around, send it right back to this body for a consistency determination. We're not talking about setting aside this flood control project. We're simply talking about making sure that the project actually mitigates its impacts and provides the information to this body necessary for it to feel comfortable that it actually complies with the Delta plan. That can be done very timely. It doesn't require setting the project aside in its entirety. And it's a very modest request, and that is my ask of you. With that, I'm happy to be quiet and listen to any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Questions? Question, Ken?
Thank you, Vice Chair Fiorini. Mr. Solari, are we that's pretty close. Your comment that legal arguments should not be made, that's hard for us to agree with, because we're talking about compliance with the regulation, which the basis is legal. I'm not a lawyer. I don't even pretend to play one on TV. There's more learned colleagues here, but I've spent most of my career, not as a CEQA expert, but being involved in CEQA and as a practitioner, CEQA requires mitigation measures to mitigate a significant impact below a threshold of significance. So we talked about this at the January hearing, and that, kind of gets to what's the baseline for impacts, and are they worsening the Hyacinth problem beyond what is the baseline for CEQA? And I think the answer that we got back then was no, they're not. But as a feature of the project, they're including this, Hyacinth removal plan, which we completely understand has not been prepared yet. But requiring it, I think what my question is, why would you expect a mitigation measure to be required if the project is not resulting in an impact above whatever the threshold of significance is?
Sure, that's a good question. So the answer is the EIR in several places actually acknowledges that the presence of the wall with this 50-foot wide gate will actually exacerbate, and that's the language of the final EIR, or draft EIR, final EIR. It will exacerbate the presence of water hyacinth within Atherton Cove, specifically because presently the water hyacinth floats in and out with the tide. But what will happen with the 50-foot gate is the water hyacinth will float in, and then it will expand, and it will become too big, and it will not be able to float out. And as a result, it will be trapped inside there, and water hyacinth grows very, very quickly. And so it'll be trapped back there, and so while under baseline conditions it would be able to float back out because the mouth is 600 feet wide, it'll be trapped in there. So to answer your question, the EIR itself acknowledges as a factual matter that this project will exacerbate water hyacinth within Atherton Cove. And the only reason that it says there will be no impact is because of this idea that it's going to mitigate that impact by developing this program, but simply not calling it mitigation and calling it a design feature of the project. That is exactly what the Lotus case deals with, is if it's mitigation, you should call it mitigation, you should include it in your MMRP, and it should be enforceable, and not have the situation here where 3 years later, your mitigation is mischaracterized as a design feature of the project, and it still hasn't been done.
So maybe you can ask staff to sort of, because this seems to be sort of the key point of the appellant with everything else sort of, we've kind of dealt with, and you've chose to focus on this. So are we talking about equivalence here, that the project design feature? Because I thought I asked the question of Sajafka whether, we had some sense of where, what baseline was, and that they weren't impacting the hyacinth growth beyond the baseline. So is that because of the inclusion of the project, the feature, the plan as a feature of the project? Or is there no significant, what was the threshold of significance? And, we're not there. And
I think that might be a more
Is it a belt
appropriate
of
question for
suspenders?
Sajafka to answer, but I want to just caution, this is moving into CEQA territory, and we're focusing here on the Delta plan. So these are CEQA-related arguments that would be litigated, and then we take, the council takes before it the record presented to it. And the record presented to it is a final EIR that contains the water hyacinth program as part of the project. So the Delta plan doesn't second guess whether mitigation should exist or not. That's a CEQA argument for the courts. The issue before the council is the record consistent with the Delta plan? And because there was not a mitigation measure here, staff's recommendation is, in this case, GP1B2 doesn't apply. And the Lotus case, I'm reviewing that right now, but The Lotus case, it seems to be that Caltrans didn't analyze the impact at all. And I don't think that's the argument being made here. The issue is whether it should have been a mitigation measure or a project element. And the project proponent wrote its EIR with it as a project element. So we have to accept that as presented to the council. But the baseline and thresholds of significance, I think, are more appropriate for SJAFCA to answer than staff.
Okay, and the CEQA issues have been litigated and went through the process and adjudicated.
I believe, and Erica can correct me if I'm wrong, we have some of the record before us, before the council, that some of the litigation has proceeded, and then staff's recommendation is to take official notice of an appellate court decision that came down after the certification of consistency, because that would be a judicially noticeable fact. But the staff analysis does not rely on any of the conclusions reached in litigation.
Okay, thank you.
Do you need Ms. Scholzlager to come up to answer your CEQA questions?
I think we should hear their thinking on this.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes, so just to be clear, I think I understand the question, which is how the project treated the Water Hyacinth Control Program. And it's true, it was considered an element of the project because as part of normal operations and maintenance for this type of facility, removal of debris that gets collected behind the gate would need to be conducted. And Mr. Saluri accurately characterized what the EIR concluded, which was there was the possibility that some material could become trapped behind the gate, including hyacinth, but that with normal removal operations, there would be no significant impact. And to address Ms. Payne's comment, these are CEQA issues. Whether something is properly characterized as a project component or a mitigation measure, the Lotus case is a key case on this. There was also a case over the Warriors Stadium. We litigated those issues in the courts, and we received a Court of Appeal opinion from the 3rd District in favor of SJAFCA on that issue. So not only is it a CEQA issue and not a Delta Plan issue, but it is a CEQA issue that has been finally resolved by the courts.
Any other questions? Then, Mr. Solari, thank you. We will now proceed to public comment. Yeah, we're going to just hold your horses. If you filled out a blue card, we're going to proceed to public comment now. And each person requesting the opportunity to address the council will be provided 3 minutes. We'll take them in the order that they're submitted. And again, I'll ask you to provide us your name and affiliation. All right. First up, Sean Brooks. And just for your help, the timer is over there just to help you keep track of your time.
And you're going to post the PDF? Hello, my name is Sean Brooks. I live at 2001 Carlton. I'm a resident off of the Smith Canal. My house is located up on the levees on the Smith Canal itself. I had approached the JAFCA meeting back in 2017 discussing what I believe would be impacts on the water levels by putting the gate, how it's going to raise the water levels in the levee. I prepared an exhibit that shows we're assuming the 100-year flood level is at 9.4. Just to run over this real quick, assuming the gate shuts down at elevation 5, the difference is about 4.4 feet. By restricting this gate and not allowing the waters in during a flood scenario, and by closing the gates, that additional storage of Smith Canal water would be impacted onto the main canal and within the Delta Pole system. Running the calculations, I assume that approximately by taking 86 acres of the Smith Canal and multiplying by 4.4 feet is 378 acre feet of water that will be stored into the rivers, which could have an impact and raise the river levels of 3.14 feet. At that time, analogy was stated by Roger Churchwell that it's a drop of water in the overall system, that it doesn't have enough to have a study performed. With my experience, I'm an engineer, graduated from the University of the Pacific. That didn't sound right for me. Any impacts need to be fully studied and analyzed in order to meet that. No matter what kind of approachments they are, down to a pile in a river needs to be analyzed in that system on how that pile is going to impact the flows. At that time, SJAFCA came back, Roger said no study would need to be performed because it's such a minor amount overall, the delta pool. Now, I went ahead and attended the seminar group on November 17, 2017, and I asked Richard Simmons, which is the FEMA flood mapping, works for FEMA flood mapping, pretty much the point question, if we put in this gate, use the gate as an example, would a full study have to be performed by the impact on what it has on the floodplain? And he clearly stated in that seminar, yes, that would be correct, that impact would have to be studied on that. And I have not seen any study. I've read a comment, but it's not a study. I have not seen a study that has analyzed this scenario. There was a comment that was made that it's only going to raise it by analyzing the whole delta short of the Sassoon Bay. But to me, that's not correct. You can't analyze the whole system as a whole. You have to take the parts that's going to reflect into. There's got to be a area that's within it that it's not going to affect all the way down to San Francisco, obviously, with the tides. That's not how our delta systems work. It's not a flat body of water. It's not a lake. It's a moving system. So as the tides come in, we're going to get different levels of waters at different places in the delta. So it's going to, by closing this off, it's going to be affecting the water on this end of the levee, of the system, the overall delta system. Okay. So I have a concern with that has not been met. And my understanding, it's a requirement, a study needs to be performed on that.
Okay. Thank you for your comments.
Any questions?
Next up, Ernest Tuft, resident of Smith Canal.
Thank you for having the meeting here today. I was surprised, actually. I didn't know. I was assuming it was going to be decided in Sacramento last month what was going to happen here in Stockton. So thank you for postponing the decision until you had a Stockton meeting. The city is largely unfamiliar with the country club neighborhood issue. Most residents among the many local politicians and even Mayor Tubbs haven't really followed, as far as I can tell, the technical details of the gate project and tend to defer to SJAFCA based on the fears of FEMA. FEMA is constantly used in SJAFCA's sales pitch for this gate during the time that they put up the vote, a vote which was dominated in terms of the electorate on the west side of the I-5, where the FEMA insurance issues are much more dire. Those of us who are on the east side who have most of the Smith Canal had very little power to do anything. We had no vote. We voted, but our votes weren't worth anything because of the way the floodplain was. So on our side, first it's a good idea to take a boat ride along the historic 2.5 mile long clamshell dug navigational channel. It's one of the oldest in the state. The Delta Stewardship Council is organized, as far as I can tell, in part because it's dangerous to allow flood control agencies to alone determine the value of state waterways. The Smith Canal is a beautiful waterway that deserves preservation. The canal has thrived from neglect, requiring no extra dredging for over its 100-year history because of a twice-daily tide exchange that conveys silt towards the San Joaquin River, reducing the mouth of the canal from 800 feet to 50 feet 50 feet's the open gate, will significantly disturb the tide exchange according to the hydrological simulation that Svyavka itself complied. They make decisions of no significant impact after showing something that even a child could look at and say, wow, something's going on here. Look at how fast that water's flowing through that narrow straw that they've got for a gate. So the gate project's not really scientific, at least as far as I can tell, because it's basically just a larger version of the seawalls, weirs, gates, dams designed to block the tide flow in the Stockton Delta. So now it's not likely that the gate will fail. Maybe it would mechanically. I had a trucking company, and I know that equipment can fail when you need it the most, but mostly it would be a problem of an insidious siltation of the canal, making it increasingly useless for navigation, recreational boating, and even stormwater drainage. Now, the cost of a retrofit along the levee walls would be much less than the gate cost, and would certainly be more satisfying in terms of water quality and long-term urban development benefits. Plus, as Svyavka will help you understand, even with the gate, the levees have to be improved, not as a secondary defense, but as a primary defense against tidal erosion and flooding. Those levees have to be, in some cases, stronger than they were before, because the water could fill up in the Smith Canal itself when the gate is closed at a high tide period. So now, one of the problems that is constantly talked about by the engineers at Svyavka is this problem of encroachment on the levees themselves. There's dilapidated homes and so forth built on the levees. It's very difficult for them to understand how to deal with the public on this. Svyavka is only in law a public agency, but it hides out and has maybe one or two members of the public coming to their meetings. And then they make big decisions that impact people. And they have not come. In my 20 years of living on the canal, I've never had them come and knock on my door and say, let's take a look at the land side of your levee and see how it looks. Is it safe? They've generally depended upon homeowners to come and report any kind of damage. But we have a long list of homeowners that have wanted to have their levees repaired. And then they'll turn around and say, well, and this is the levee districts in Svyavka kind of combined. They work together. They have the same contractors working in both places. Then they'll say, well, you're one of a long list of people. Tiresome as it is, we can't get to your part of the levee yet. Unless, of course, a beaver puts a hole in it, then they're forced to do that. Okay, and at that point, they come in and do a big rock job that looks like something you'd see in Los Angeles. Now, I know you're going to cut me off here in a minute. I'm probably the public.
I think you've covered the issue. We understand your concern.
I'd like to finish, though, my remarks, if you don't mind. Is that okay with you?
Your time's up.
Okay,
Can you be very brief?
Yes, I will. I'll finish it up. Very good. I think, actually, I can see, okay, so the gate will degrade the fish habitat and the recreational potential, and I believe Svyavka should be, that the Delta Stewardship Council should turn this back to them and say, please, let's look at something that's more modern, more scientific. We're not talking about going back in time. The gate this is a 1950s, 1960s solution that even the Dutch wouldn't put in today. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Next up, Dominic Gooley. I think I pronounced the last name correctly.
Yeah, I requested to be last. Are there any more speakers behind me?
Yes.
Could I be the last speaker, please?
Just proceed. It's not going to make any difference whether you're first or last. We're going to consider all the comments as we get them.
So I had some questions for the staff on some of the comments that they made. Could I ask those first prior to starting my presentation?
Why don't you state your positions first, and then if staff or the council have questions, to pursue.
I
we'll
have
do that.
questions for staff. When they asked you for questions, I had some staff. They made some comments in there. And they had a map up there. I'd like to clarify some things on it.
That's fine. That's what you have
No, I
the
have
3 minutes for.
I have public comments. But rather than use my public comments to ask questions, I would like to use them to make my comments and ask the questions separate if I could.
Please make your comments.
Okay, so the question for staff is the Fish and Wildlife ex parte communication that was received during the thing, is that part of the, oh, you're timing me, huh? Okay, 3 minutes, huh? Anyways, there's a Fish and Wildlife. To be clear, my name's Dominic Gooley, okay, and I've tried to help SJAFCA for many years. I submitted an alternate solution to the problem, fixing the levees, just like Ernie talked about along the levee. It's about half the price, and it does meet the urban levee design criteria. SJAFCA's ignored it. The Fish and Wildlife letter that's in there relative to Patrick's case states that they're going to require another residence time analysis, and they want a water, as far as the Hyacinth treatment, they want to know what chemicals are going to be used, what rate of application is going to be used, how they're going to measure dissolved oxygen. And the letter that's in the ex parte communication was a response to Mr. Elias's application for incidental take permit, which was sent back. So the permit has been rejected back to SJAFCA to resubmit, which includes the residence time analysis and the water quality and Hyacinth plan. I submitted numerous comments throughout this whole process. I did not know about the appeal process. I was not notified. SJAFCA didn't have a meeting regarding this. And then, but I think that you guys should consider, by the way, thank you for coming down to Stockton. That's a very good thing to do. And if I sound mad, it's not against you guys, it's more against the San Joaquin Area Flood Control Agency. And again, I'm a pro per acting as a district attorney or attorney general in the state of California in CEQA. So this case has not been approved by CEQA. I'm submitting my brief here shortly, and I have, Hyacinth isn't even one of my issues. My issue is boater safety, water flow, aesthetic impacts, right-of-way. Aaron here said that the project is next to the Stockton Deepwater Ship Channel. It is, in fact, within the Deepwater Ship Channel. The Dad's Point recreational area shown on the map, they didn't show the flood walls that were on there. And if you go to the Lewis Point boat ramp, this project also includes a single sheet pile flood wall with a concrete cap located at that point greater than 5 feet high. So the view just right there, you will not be able to see the San Joaquin River from Dad's Point because of the view. Defective administrative record is one of my CEQA appeal items. The record is completely defective. They did not include stuff. The attorney paid for the record, which is illegal, according to Black Historical Society case that says that the agency shouldn't, they spent over $120,000 preparing the administrative record, such that myself and Patrick would not see some of the things. They redacted things left and right. So my case is still alive. There's many administrative remedies available to me here in the future, specifically the State Lands Commission has to give them a lease, which is problematic because the Stockton Deepwater Ship Channel was conveyed, was bought by people and sold to the state lands, and then the state lands has the right-of-way for the public trust doctrine, recreation, commerce, navigation, not flood control. And then to Mr. Vegas, Ms. Oschlager gave a different answer today. He asked about how are they going to enforce the monitoring of the water hyacinth. And I'll read out of the transcript from agenda item 13, Mr. Villegas. So the issue of legally enforceable, there is a monitoring plan. And legally enforcement, what does that look like? What is legally enforceable? Ms. Oschlager states, so CEQA is a self-enforcing statute in a sense, right? So when the agency is tasked, when an agency is doing a project on its own, it sort of has to monitor itself in terms of complying with the conditions. That's the case of a state agency or a local agency moving forward with that. If it is a private project, the agency who approved the project is responsible for making sure that that private entity does what it has to do and go and do. And that's the case, whether something is an element of the project or a mitigation measure, which would be typically, but it's enforceable by members of the public, right? The public can take a writ of mandamus against an agency. You have to start at the administrative level, but essentially, if SJAFCA is not doing their job, like taking the Hyacinth out in a timely manner, someone from the public can go in and say, you are abusing your discretion by moving forward, by not following through on the project that you said you were going to do, and so you're going to build. So it's essentially a publicly enforceable obligation. She goes on to say,
Mr. Gooley, you've exhausted your time. Do you have any quick points, other additional points you'd like to make?
yeah, I would. I used a 4-point system for making a decision. What's the best thing that can happen if you go along with the staff's recommendations? Not much. The gate moves on. What's the worst thing that can happen if you approve the staff's recommendations? The worst thing is that the final letter of map revision for the gate cannot be obtained. The U.S. Coast Guard doesn't approve this project, to which, according to the record, there is no correspondence with the Coast Guard. The State Lands Commission doesn't issue the lease, or the funding is not obtained. In short, your credibility is going to be tarnished if you approve this and then someone else shoots it down, or if I win in court. Trust and believe in me. What's the best thing that can happen if you request for SJAFCA to redo their certification and have the board make the determination in front of the public, these people, and then resubmit? Your credibility is maintained, and your decision is based on best available science, and proper administrative procedures are adhered to. Adaptive management. They decline to do it, but when a project gets so expensive, right, as it is right now, and so convoluted, and so hard to get the permits for, you got to adapt. And I included some slides for this program, and obviously in 3 minutes I couldn't do it, but I trust that you've all reviewed those slides and understand the engineering issues. Mr. Sean Brooks works for me, by the way. He's a great employee, and he's absolutely right. Because when water's moving up, the law of inertia, Newton's law of inertia says when an object is in motion, it will stay in motion until acted upon by an equal and opposite force. And when it's coming up the river and hits the Smith Canal Gate, it's not going to turn around and go to Rio Vista. It's going to keep going up. Because right there where the Smith Canal Gate, the current flood plain, the flood stage elevation has what's known as a hydraulic jump. And that hydraulic jump is going to jump higher. Thank you all for being stewards of the Delta. Please defer this thing. It's not ripe and ready. They've got a lot to do in order to, there's no sense wasting everybody's time and money when Mr. Solari sues you again, or sues you and SJAFCA again. It would be a shame. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert Kavanaugh. Yes, that's fine.
I'm Robert Kavanaugh. I live on Atherton Island. I live within 100 yards of where this gate is going, and I've been a proponent for the gate for a long time. I got excited when I heard it was going to be built, and I'm really disappointed in how long it's taken in the courts, and I guess, and that's not your concern at this point in time. But I see the gate as a breakwater. I served on the Port Commission for 10 years, and I tried to get the port director to put a 5-mile zone from Rough and Ready Island all the way to the head of the channel, but that doesn't go. Large boats come up. We get a wake up against the island, and of course the erosion that's going on is both on the point at the park and the rest is a little frightening. I've got spots on my property that is slowly leaning into the river. We have a launch ramp right there at the mouth of the Smith, and needless to say, the folks blowing in and out of there, this is going to slow them down. So, and then I heard something about Hyacinth, and I've been fighting with Hyacinth for a long, long time. But where does it come from? It comes out of the main channel, and it washes in, and then it loads up to the launch ramp around our docks and into the cove. Now, yeah, some of it's going to get trapped in there, but it's going to be one heck of a lot less in there as a result of the gate. So the gate's a win-win from my perspective. And that's it. Anybody got any questions and want to go boating, give me a call.
Thank you very much. The last request I have is from Martina Gooley.
Hi there.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to start off by thanking you for coming to Stockton today. My name's Martina. I grew up here in Stockton. I went to St. Mary's High School. I currently work in Pleasanton, so I commute to the East Bay every day on the 580 corridor. I'm an account recruiting manager for a construction staffing company. And I took the day off to be here to speak on behalf of a resident of Stockton. There was a great point that was brought up at the November meeting, the SJAFCA meeting back in November. And the concern was the effect that the gate will have on the Port of Stockton. There's been plans for the Army Corps of Engineers to deepen our channel so that we can have our port be comparable to the Oakland port to bring in, these large cargo ships. Right now, driving on 580, there's a lot of, semi trucks. It, makes traffic really bad. And I think, if as Stockton, if we were able to deepen our channel, we could bring in, the large cargo ships and not have issues with traffic. It would bring more jobs to our community, more money, make Stockton a more desirable place to live. There's a map here for the future plans for the Army Corps of Engineers of what they want to do in regards to making Stockton a deeper channel. And if we, were to build the gate, with the levee, that wouldn't allow us to deepen it or widen the channel to make that effective and follow through with those plans. So that's one of the points that I wanted to bring up today. Another is just the recreation piece of it. Growing up in Stockton, I played softball at the Lewis Park, and we used to have tournaments there. And as a young girl, we would go to the Dad's Point and use that as a place to go swimming and barbecue. And if we were to build the gate and the levee, that would take away just another fun recreation piece that Stockton has to offer. And I think that as a community, we really need to focus on what's going to be beneficial to make Stockton a more desirable place to live and not take away from it. In addition, it's expensive. It's not. There's alternative solutions that we can utilize that are going to be more cost effective. I think that we should really consider the cheaper solutions and what's going to be in Stockton's best interest for our future here. So thank you again for coming out today, and I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for taking the time to come.
Thank you.
Appreciate your comments. Next up, Shelley Gooley.
I'm a Stockton resident, Shelley Gooley. You guys, this is a boondoggle. This whole thing on this gate is a boondoggle. The same people that want to put this gate in are the same people that have worked on Stockton all their lives, and no one else could get their foot in the door as far as an engineer goes. It's a boondoggle. There's so many cheaper ways to do this, people. And there are ideas. My husband has created an idea, and they didn't even read it. They did not read it. My husband spent 6 months to come up with an idea, wrote a book, a plan, and they didn't even read it. You know why? Because they already had it set in motion that we are going to build this gate, and you're not going to stop us. We're building it. And they're the same people. They want to load their pockets, people. It's all about loading their pockets. It's a boondoggle. We do not need a $1 million gate in Stockton. We don't need it. I grew up in Stockton. I've lived here all my life. There are way better ways to do it, and they're lying to the people. They're lying to the residents, and it's just, we don't need it. There's way more effective ways to do it. And as I said, when my husband presented his book, or the plan for what he had, they did not read it. They already had in motion who they were going to pick. Yes, I don't want to mention the engineering firm. You probably already know who it is. They said, we're giving the job to them. They're going to do it. He has a hard time getting his foot in the door. He's moved here from Massachusetts. Nobody knows him. Very educated man and worth listening to. He's got more character and honesty than anybody I know. And he has tried to tell the truth to these people and say, hey, let's do this. But they don't want to hear it. They don't want a better idea. Why? Why do they not want a better idea? Because they want to load their pockets like they've been loading it. And no one has ever checked their work. As all the work that they've done all this time, no one has ever checked their work. They send out experts here. Oh, send an expert here. Send an expert there. Oh, we'll just send our expert out, and costing, millions of dollars. So that's all I want to say. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, and I forgot to say that where the gate they want to put up, it's going to be really ugly. It's not aesthetically, it's ugly. It's big and it's ugly. And there's a beach there. And it's a beautiful beach. I see a lot of the less fortunate people coming, and that's where they like to swim. That is their swimming area. They don't have pools, and that's their place to go swimming. We can't do that. Just better ways. Just look into some other opportunities. That's all I'm asking, is look into other options. Okay, thank you again. Bye.
Thank you. Do I have any others who wish to address the council? Okay, hearing no further requests, we will now close the public comment portion of this hearing. We will now hear from any council members who wish to speak on proposed findings. Any council members wish to speak? Okay, thank you, members. Do I have a motion to adopt the proposed determination recommended by staff? Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Microphone.
We are not a free agency as an appellate body. This is a quasi-judicial body at this point, and we are constrained by the law that the Delta Reform Act, and that is paramount. And as a result, we're not here to determine if this project is the best project, or is right or wrong, but is it actually consistent with the Delta Reform Act? That's what our job is. So I think it's very important that we keep our eye on the ball here in that respect. Nothing further to add.
Hi, everybody. It's terrific to be here in Stockton. My mother-in-law grew up in Stockton, but I won't hold that against the city. And both my mother-in-law and father-in-law are graduates of UOP, so it's wonderful to be here. It was great seeing the city again today and last night. And I want to thank all the members of the public who came here, because we're a government body, and even on something like this where we have a narrow focus and a narrow vote before us, it's really important to hear from all of you. Mr. Gooley, you made some really good points. I mean, just terrific points, and your family did too. And I just want to thank you for all the effort you put into this, because I think your knowledge of the situation is really profound, and I think it helps inform the government a lot better. And I hope the agency does consider your proposal and for this or maybe future projects or something. And I do hope they look into it. And Mr. Meserve, Mr. Solari, you made some really fascinating legal point. I'm going to read that case, that Lotus case. Even though I take the advice of our counsel that I don't think we're making a secret determination today, I understand your point that it's analogous and it's an analogous part of the law. But this is I think this is a rather tough decision, but I think the staff did a very thorough job as well in briefing us, and I want to thank you as well for doing that. And again, thanks to everybody who came out today.
Any other comments? Then let's proceed to the vote. The vote would be to adopt the proposed determination recommended by staff.
Weinberg, aye.
Gatto, aye.
Damrell, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Villegas, aye.
Okay, we have a 5-0 vote. The council has denied the appeal. SJAFCA may proceed with the Smith Canal Gate project, and the ex parte communication restriction surrounding this appeal is lifted. Parties, with respect to administrative next steps, our clerk will certify the council's official determination. Once that is done, Executive Officer Jessica Pearson will transmit the certified determination to you via the service list, and will also post it on the council's webpage for the specific covered action appeal. As I mentioned earlier today, once we have the rough transcript, we will share it with you via the service list and post it on our webpage in approximately 2 weeks. I want to thank all the participants and the attendees. This hearing is now adjourned, and we'll take a 10-minute recess.
Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch. We're reconvening the March 21 Delta Stewardship Council meeting. We have some changes to the sequence of agenda items. As you may have noticed on each of our agendas, we explained that we might consider agenda items in a different order. And because we have some science items that I think should be collectively presented, and because science is such an inherent part of what we do, we'll be moving agenda item 9 to immediately after agenda item 5. And then we'll move from the endorsement of the update of the Delta Science Plan to the lead scientist's report. And after that, we'll have the executive officer's report and the 5-year review. So with that, let's move to agenda item 4, adoption of the February 21, 2019 meeting summary.
So moved.
Mike Gatto moves and Oscar Villegas seconds. Is there any discussion? Okay, ready for the vote?
Weinberg, aye.
Gatto, aye.
Damrell, aye.
Fiorini, aye.
Tatayan, aye.
Villegas, aye.
Very good. For the chair's report, I just want to briefly mention that we're making good progress on planning and preparing for the April 8, 2019 Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting. We'll have on the agenda the item we're about to hear, the Delta Science Funding Resiliency Strategy, and then we'll also be focusing on successes in ecosystem restoration. With that, let's move on to Amanda Bowl and Randy Fiorini and Jason Peltier. They'll be telling us about the Delta Science Funding Resiliency Strategy.
Good afternoon. Get Amanda Bowl, coordinator of the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee, and I know Jason Peltier is here. So as soon as he gets here, we will add him to the panel. But as Chair Tatayan mentioned, the April 8th DPIC meeting is fast approaching. We're just 2 weeks away, and we'll be discussing a couple of items at the meeting. But one item in particular we wanted to discuss today. You have some information in your binders about this particular item, and this is related to the Funding Science to Meet Tomorrow's Challenges, which is the white paper that the Delta Science Funding Initiative Work Group developed to start looking at and to start discussing the issues around science funding in the Delta. The group was convened about a year ago by then Chair Randy Fiorini to provide kind of a broad look at science funding and to pull all the stakeholders together to discuss the various issues around this. So we had a broad representation of membership from or participation from public water agencies, state and federal agencies, as well as NGOs. And the idea was to identify how to adequately fund science in the Delta, to support decision making, and to build on current efforts that promote coordinated science, to develop action-oriented recommendations to improve support of science in the Delta for decision making. And all of this resulted in a collaborative document, which is again, the science funding white paper that we're calling it. And kind of what we found as we were developing this white paper was that science-based expenditures over the past 10 years have totaled nearly $1 billion, but these expenditures in the Delta have been notably less than other similar large-scale ecological efforts. And that the funding that we do have is largely limited to core monitoring, status and trends monitoring, and some targeted outreach. But there really hasn't been consistent long-term funding for more emerging science needs and issues. So through a series of work group meetings, we kind of worked through kind of what these key issues were and developed a set of identified 3 issues, 3 main barriers to increasing science funding, and then came up with a list of recommendations related to each of those issues. And the white paper is in your binders, and I do want to give just a quick shout out to Yumiko Henneberry, who will be speaking later, who was really kind of the lead author in this document, and we could not have done it without her. So I'll just briefly go over what the key issues and recommendations are, and then Randy's going to talk a little bit about kind of how we got here and a bit more about why we did this. And then when Jason gets here, he can also address a little bit, and there he is, about just how this kind of links to other discussions that are currently going on in the system as well. So the first issue that we identified was the need for shared and rigorous mechanisms to critically assess science and monitoring efforts. And the challenge that we really identified was that it's really hard to estimate science-based expenditures. A lot of times we're comparing apples to oranges because we have different fiscal years, we have different ways of reporting information. And so the recommendations for this are to develop standard accounting protocols, develop a web-based tracking of expenditures, potentially using the science tracker, which is identified in the science plan. And then having a critical review of science funding, really kind of taking a big look at what we've been funding, how we're funding it, what questions we're answering, what questions we need to be answering, so we can really understand what we're doing here. The second issue, limited interchange among policymakers, scientists, and the public to inform science funding priorities and management questions. We found that it's a lot of times there's unclear alignment of management and science needs, and that there's also limited guidance for compliance monitoring programs. And so the recommendations around this issue are to establish more interchange between decision makers, stakeholders, and scientists. So there are a number of collaborative endeavors out there that try to do this, but we found that we need more. And there also needs to be more interchange between the existing collaborative endeavors as well. So for example, DPIC, CSAMP, the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program, and the Interagency Ecological Program known as IEP. We're also recommending that we promote decision support tools such as integrated modeling and structured decision making, and that we develop protocols to evaluate monitoring programs. And then the final issue that we identified, which was really kind of the primary issue that we plan to really just focus on, but we obviously identified all these a number of other issues as well, but is the need for consistent funding across the Delta Science enterprise. Our key findings here was that there is inconsistent and fragmented research efforts, limited staff assigned to turn data into information, and information isn't sufficiently accessible or digestible by decision makers and stakeholders. So we have a few recommendations around this. One is to develop topic-specific Delta Science implementation plans, and this is already slightly underway. CSAMP is working on a Delta Smelt-specific implementation plan, so we're recommending that we do the same for other issues. That we secure additional sources of reliable funding to achieve Delta Science needs, that we support open science by implementing current roadmaps for collaborative and open data access, analysis, and synthesis, and that we support more user-friendly and timely information sharing. So really seeing what we can do to improve in science and to improve and increase science communication throughout the system. So with that, I will ask Randy and Jason to say a few words about kind of how we got here and again how this all connects to other issues.
I'll just very briefly, Jason and I, John Calloway, were a half of a panel that occurred at the Estuary Conference in October of 2017. And the conclusion among the panelists was we need to discuss this matter of science funding further. So Jason and Leo Winternitz and John Calloway and I got together and initiated a work group that grew over time. And it has been a marvelous group to work with. A variety of views, lots of opinions, not always linking or in alignment with each other, but we worked through and created this white paper. And I'd like to defer to Jason to describe his impressions about where we've come from and where we're going.
Got turned on. Okay. Jason Pelt here with the Coalition for a Sustainable Delta. That's an interesting last point you just made, Randy, of where are we going. I think this is a really exciting effort, and we can go a lot of different places with it. We already have come a long ways. I should start with kudos, though, to you, Randy, for your leadership. Thank you so much. Amanda and the folks at the council's staff have been fantastic, prodding us along, and great kudos to the work group, as Randy mentioned. This is a well-attended, you're talking about people's money, right? So they're going to be at the table. And well-attended, good participation. It's just really a model of collaborative work in the work group. I think it's just been a great experience. And what started as a conversation about how do we get more money for science evolved into many different places. The first meeting we had this conversation about, and Jason says, well, let's have a campaign to raise more money. But now Leo was wise and said, no, if we're going to ask for more money, we've got to be able to explain what money we have and how we're spending it. That led to the development of a matrix, a spreadsheet that shows by agency how much money they put into science over the last few years. And we're running close to $100 million a year. That's a number that caught everybody's attention because we had never toted it up, so to speak. So $100 million a year is an awful lot, especially when you consider that doesn't include the personnel costs associated with those science activities. That caused me and some everybody, I think, to somewhat step back and say, wait, then maybe the first objective is not to raise more money, but to understand really what we have, how it's being spent. And Amanda just talked about the recommendations that start getting us into those mechanics. As we started developing the white paper, a lot of doors started opening up, as I like to say. And the doors were representative of ongoing concerns and conversations that have been held at the camp table, CSAMP, the collaborative science table, and that got us into this bigger picture that's represented by what's in the white paper. Some standout conclusions on my part that I draw from this work effort so far. That first, we've created a very tangled web of how we're doing business in the Delta, and we need to have a conversation about how can we modernize it? How can we improve this web and find a better way of doing business? Because it's a pretty universal thought. We've created a really complex situation, and maybe this really complex Delta requires a complex situation to deal with it. But everybody's got a level of unease with where we have arrived. We need to exploit the opportunity to re-examine our funding priorities. That's, I think, goes along with that. We've got $100 million that's being spent. Does it reflect what our priorities are? We need to modernize how we're doing business, and a couple of very specific examples are, the first recommendation is in the white paper speaks to regularizing how we account for the money we spend. Let's get out of apples and oranges and into all pears. That's a very specific business practice that needs to be improved. Another good example is the monitoring program. There are some 200 different monitoring programs that go on in the Delta. Some 80% of that $100 million goes to compliance monitoring, however you phrase, whatever is meant by that. I'm not sure, but and we all, and there's broad recognition that while compliance monitoring is important, it's in some ways it's just counting, and we're not learning from that investment in monitoring. So modernizing that business, those practices is also important. And then as to the connections with other things that are going on out in the world, in the biggest priority, I think the universal priority we all share is making the existing system work better, and we do many things that are all in one way or another linked to that objective. This work effort fits into the collaborative science work that's going on, and it fits in uniquely into the voluntary settlement agreement discussion that's going on, which is all about finding a new way of doing business in the Delta. I think the key place we're at right now, and where we'll be when we have a conversation at DPIC, is how can we nurture this? How can we continue it and prioritize it and get the right people to stay involved and stay plugged in for the next step, which is, I think we all agree that the white paper is a final draft, but it'll continue to live and evolve. But how are we going to implement these things? When you start talking, there's two things we can fight over really well. One is power or authority, and the other is money. And when we start talking, we've gotten a long ways down the road without stepping on toes here, which is awesome. But at some point, you start stepping on toes, and people feel threatened, and they don't want to engage in a collaborative effort that might put some of their financial resources at risk. But so it's going to really take some leadership to get the participants going in the right direction and continuing in the right direction. A final thought is the consistent funding is not a problem for a whole bunch of the $100 million, because it's coming from water users, and water users pay their bills. But I agree but there are other good points associated with funding about the need to, how the funding and the science enterprise interact, and is very important. But also very important is the need to diversify the sources of money. We've got a lot of public benefit coming from a lot of the work that goes on, and there needs to be a broader, I think, investment of public general funds, so to speak, in the science enterprise as we go forward. So those are my conclusions, and for now. And again, thank you, Amanda.
So the next step is to take this white paper to DPIC at the April meeting and ask the DPIC group to endorse it and to form a work group. our goal is to keep the group that has been working on this intact. And there's already state and federal agencies that are part of DPIC on the work group. So provide an opportunity to add more agency representatives to the existing work group. The Independent Science Board received a draft copy of this last December. They have weighed in and expressed a lot of interest in participating. So I would expect that DPIC might allow 2 or 3 Independent Science Board members to continue. And the goal will be to develop an implementation plan for funding science to meet tomorrow's challenges by the November meeting at DPIC. And the idea is to have this teed up so that in the next fiscal year, if there are solid recommendations related to federal, state, or other funding, that we'll have a good idea or have a good roadmap by November. So it's been an aggressive timeline from the beginning, and we've met our deadlines thus far. And we just wanted to provide you all with the draft white paper and provide you a vision for where we hope to take this. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
No, I mean, the paper's really well written, and once again, you've not taken a easy issue on or clear cut. You know, Jason, you said a lot of this, the money is from the water users and compliance based. How big an issue is it, or how constrained do the agencies think they are in terms of how they can redirect their science funding? Because that, that seems, if they are constrained, or do you got to get the water users to agree? Because boy, the idea of prioritizing it makes tremendous sense. But are you up against sort of this obstacle of, the funds they view it as restricted or dedicated to whatever they're doing?
I'm sure that's the first response, but I think we can go beyond that and get into some more depth as to why they're doing what they're doing. So it kind of reminds me of the water quality standards themselves. We have years of, well, let's put another requirement, and we can't remember what those down at the bottom of the stack, why we decided that was important to do. With the monitoring, there's a need to be sensitive to the value and importance of a long-term record of the condition of the conditions in the delta. So some of that monitoring needs to be, we need to preserve and protect that, but that doesn't mean we can't evolve away from the way we've been doing business. And do they have flexibility? Well, yes, I'm sure there's plenty of flexibility, but it's kind of like the bigger picture here, which is DPIC has no authority to do anything, right? It's a voluntary collaborative effort. And this is going to be the same way, because we're not going to tell people you got to change. We're going to have to find how to come to agreement on how we can modernize and get more bang for the buck, and then people can move in that way. And if everybody agrees that this is the way we've got to go, and we need to change in a regulation, or we need to change in a statute or a policy, there should be built in a political, small p political unit of folks that are willing to work for that change.
So because we've done it this way forever, doesn't mean that's the best way to do it or achieve what we're trying to achieve in the Delta. So that, there should be this inherent flexibility to redirect money to what's, going to move the ball forward or
That's a very common sense statement. And
I try to make common sense, but you've helped us understand an important thing that probably isn't going to end with just the submission of the white paper or.
No, but that's where we enter the forest, because how we can translate this to specific implementable actions with timelines and clear objectives and timelines and deliverables, et cetera, is it's going to be a function of, do people want to, are they willing to take some risks? Are they willing to step forward and say, yeah, there's got to be a better way, and we're going to be part of making that better way, and it's all got to be working together. There's no command and control here. The state board does have some command and control in terms of what the compliance monitoring means, but again, if you went back and you asked them, why are we doing this monitoring right here, right now, at this, what's the reason for that? There's a lot of them that people would say because there was a problem at some point and we thought we needed to keep an eye on it, and
it's in somebody's permit, so we just keep
it's
doing
in
it.
somebody's permit. But they found, if you look at the normal Delta smelt monitoring, the Kodiak trawls and fall midwater trawl and stuff, Fish and Wildlife Service recognized the inadequacy of that monitoring to give a good picture, because it's pretty simple. You don't find smelt, or you're going to find them near the bank, and you don't take a big boat with a big net and go next to the bank. So they developed the enhanced Delta smelt monitoring program, which uses new tools and new ways, and that was all voluntary. It was all on their good, because they knew that they weren't getting, they could get better information, and they have. So evolution is definitely possible.
Hey, well, thank you for pushing the envelope, and Vice Chair Fiorini.
John, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think in terms of the monitoring, definitely there's a need to really evaluate it and be sure that what we're doing is appropriate, but there's lots of benefit in the continuity and the long-term monitoring, so I don't think we're going to throw out everything and completely start over, but I think there's interest. One thing I wanted to mention is the Independent Science Board has already started an effort to evaluate monitoring, and so they're putting together an inventory that will be really useful, I think, as we go forward to implement this, because they're just in the midst of working with a contractor to put together an inventory of what the costs are, what the questions are, what the methods are for all the broad scope of monitoring within the Delta that will really help to think about which are the most critical things that we want to be sure to have as baseline information to carry forward, what are things where maybe there's redundancy or other things. The other thing I think also to point out is that it may not always be a reduced cost. So you mentioned, Jason, I think the enhanced Delta smelt monitoring definitely provides a lot more information, but it also costs a whole lot more. And so we have to really think about where we want to prioritize and where we can find efficiencies, and then where there are deficiencies and where we need to put more effort to get better information.
I should also point out that the letter from the Independent Science Board to DPIC talking about their broad views of the state of our science enterprise, if you will, is really an interesting read. It's pretty high level. There's a lot of depth to it, and it's totally in the same vein, I think, as kind of the white paper in this whole work group effort. It's finding a better way to do business, and the way I put it is, we made this web. How can we make it better? And I think we need to be realistic also, that not only will we run into institutional and personality issues as we go forward, there's no doubt about that, but you could take this very far. This could be a very, very big initiative, but we need some appetite control here, because if we get ahead of ourselves, it's just going to be one more unsuccessful effort to make things better. That's all it'll be, and we ought not let it be that. We ought to make sure we're focused enough and realistic enough about what we can evolve and how we can get the way we do business in better shape. Before we say we're going to create a whole new CalFed or a whole new structure, and we're going to realign a bunch of agencies, and we're going to move people around, and we need to take it one bite at a time.
One last question, if
Go
I
ahead,
can. So one of the conclusions in the white paper is, and Amanda, you said this, is not that compared to other similar efforts, there's, we're not in that same range of funding. I guess, 100 million a year sounds like a lot of money, and
it is.
It is. I know. I mean, I think about what can you build? What kind of restoration projects could you do if you were getting 100 million a year, or other infrastructure? So maybe if you can explain, why, what is the right level, or why should we look at this differently, in terms of achieving the co-equal goals that, you need more than 100 million a year, or, the problems are so big. Maybe that's something, I don't know that I got that out of the white paper.
Well, I, for one, wouldn't even try to answer that question.
I was like,
maybe that's one of the markers on the horizon that we're trying to reach, because if we have difficulty explaining what the current program is now without being buried, and so how does it need to evolve, and what does it need to evolve? That's kind of what the whole work effort's all about, I think.
Yeah, I would just add that, I think that's why we started the paper with the first issue is just figuring out what it is we're spending money on, so that we can really understand that first before we can figure out what it is that we need to ask for. But on the flip side, I think, there's also, I think the point that the ISB is starting to make is that we really need to make sure that we have a science system set up that can deal with, the science and management needs in a rapidly changing climate. And we don't know exactly what that is. And so I think, to the degree that we have the support to do that type of research and to figure those things out, we know what we have right now isn't adequate either. So it's kind of like having parallel tracks. We need to figure out what we have, but we also got to figure out what is all the stuff we really need to be looking at on the horizon and funding long term. And so how do we kind of move both along in a parallel way? So the implementation work group has this work cut out for it.
Yeah, 100 million here, 100 million there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. I couldn't stop that.
When the group was first getting together and we were thinking about, is there a target amount of money? And so Randy asked us that. Well, how much money do we need? One exercise that we did to think about that was to look at the items in the science action agenda and identify, if we were to think about the 15 or so items that are there and really try to address those, we picked a couple. So we thought about, okay, for nutrient issues, if we really wanted to get a much better understanding of nutrient issues and the connection of nutrient issues to food web issues within the Delta, talking around to a number of people, they talked about $10 to $15 to $20 million a year to address that kind of a question if we really want to get into the detail and understand, not just monitor what's happening, but understand what are the dynamics that are causing, that are linking nutrient issues to productivity issues. And so I think, if we think about that, 100 million certainly is a large amount. I think, as was said, most of that currently is going to monitoring. So the case we were trying to make in the third point is that we need to put, not 100 million, but we need to put some significant component of that into research beyond just monitoring that helps us to understand the mechanisms and the processes around all of these challenging management issues. And also, I think it's important to note that in saying that there's not as much funding coming into the Delta, it's really mostly federal funds, because as was said, most of the money currently is coming through the support through the water suppliers or the water users. And there is much less spent in the Delta and the San Francisco Bay than there are in terms of federal funds than in other similar systems like Chesapeake. And I think the Science Enterprise Workshop really highlighted that difference.
What John has just described is what we referred to as decision support science, and we differentiated that from compliance monitoring. And we found two things. Number one, there's not a lot of funding going into things such as supporting the science action agenda gap science needs. And then also, there is not a consistent, ongoing, dependable source of funding for projects that may require 10 years of research. So those were the two big gaps that we identified, and we tried to incorporate that into the recommendations that are in here. It may not come through that clear, but that's what motivated us to begin this work group, and it stayed in this, and hopefully will be a part of the implementation plan that comes out of DPIC. The names of the 20-plus committee members, work group members, are at the end of this. In addition to Amanda and Ryan and Yumi from our staff that contributed a lot to this, if you see the people listed on the work group, thank them, because they have devoted a lot of time and energy, and it's been one of the most rewarding projects I've been a part of because of the level of interest and the consistent attendance and participation. So hopefully this is just step one in probably a three-step process.
Did you want to say more about the ISB letter?
No, I think we've covered it fairly well.
Okay.
I will just, encourage everyone to either attend DPIC on April 8th or listen in. It will be webcast, and we'll have a panel. I think Randy, Jason, and myself talking about the science funding white paper and its recommendations, and then the ISB will have 3 members participating in and presenting as well their ideas, their recommendations, and then we hope to have a really good, robust discussion with the DPIC members about the recommendations and how the implementation portion of this can move forward.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Before we move on, I want to note that we will not be having a closed session. So agenda item 12 will not be addressed today. Oscar? Sure.
Can I just make a comment on this? First of all, as you're walking away, Randy, thank you very much for your leadership on this issue. The one thing that I want to pick up on, and that is in part because I think I represent a local decision-making hat on this body, and that is, under the recommendations, I was happy to see establish effective interchange between decision makers, and I'm hoping that as you get to step 2 or 3, I think the next steps down the road, that in light of what the white paper outlines, that it would seem to me that the most effective implementation of a lot of the recommendations that are identified here would be most effective if at some point that interchange between local decision makers, where oftentimes sort of that ultimate land use authority body has some say, is on board and is aware and understands and recognizes the value of science as it sort of gets embedded in policy decisions on the front end. Rather, it's easier to bring folks along at a rate that they can chew and digest rather than force feeding. And I'm not saying that's what this is. I just simply use that as an example of oftentimes at the localist level where folks, decision makers are met with constituents, at the grocery store on a daily basis. These kinds of concepts on the front end with a little bit of education can go a long ways, at least certainly for me. And so I use that as an example to say I think that's a great recommendation under 2.1. And so I hope that interchange includes the localist level. So. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, do we have any public comment on this item? No, thank you. On to agenda item 9, endorsement of the update to the Delta Science Plan. For this item, we'll be hearing from lead scientist John Calloway and Yumi Hannaberry.
Thank you very much, and I want to really highlight the work that Dr. Yumiko Henneberry has done for the science plan. She's been the leader within the science program to update the science plan. She did such a good job on the work on the science plan that Randy drafted her to take on the funding initiative, and you saw how good of a job was done on the funding initiative. So she's really done an amazing job pulling together a broad range of input that she's going to highlight. Lots of engagement with stakeholders and others to really make the science plan the community science plan, not just the science program science plan. The initial science plan was done in 2013, right after the Delta plan, and at that time I think there was a lot of tension within the science community, a lot of talk of combat science, and a need to bring together the science community, the idea of doing one Delta, one science, of engaging stakeholders, really thinking about how do we do science in a way that effectively addresses the management decisions that are so challenging within the Delta, and that really move forward the achievement of the co-equal goals. And because science is always evolving and the challenges are always evolving, it's really like a treadmill. We're constantly trying to keep up with things. I think one of the things that the ISB really highlighted in the DPIC letter is that the treadmill's going faster and getting steeper, and our challenge is not just to deal with today's issues, but to be more forward thinking and really think about how do we create a science effort within the community to address the challenging issues coming forward. And so there's a lot of synergy between what the science plan, the updated science plan has put forward, and the efforts with the funding initiative and ISB's letter. So it's nice to have them grouped together like that. So with that, I will turn it over to Yumi, and she will give you an overview of the update for the science plan.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, council members, and thank you for this opportunity to present to you. So again, the purpose of this discussion is to provide the council with an overview of the Delta Science Plan review and update, and give you the context to take action on the Delta Science Program's request that the council endorse the 2019 updated Delta Science Plan. So I'll first take about 10 minutes to provide you with an overview of the Delta Science Plan, the review and update process, and really I want to emphasize that this was really a group effort that involved the entire science program, the council, and like the wider Delta Science community. And so it's been a really great experience. And also just to emphasize the relationship that the science plan has to the council, as well as the funding document that was presented earlier. And then I'll conclude with the request and discuss some brief next steps. So John provided a really great introduction of why the Delta Science Plan came to be. I just wanted to reiterate that it is a recommendation in the Delta Plan. It is mentioned in Chapter 2, Recommendation GR1. And again, at the time, science efforts were conducted by multiple entities without really an overarching plan among them for sharing this information and coordinating. So this fragmented approach really led to incomplete scientific information and high uncertainty, and as John said, conflicts. So the Delta Science Plan was developed to guide how science should be conducted, so it's more collaborative, and how the resulting information can be used to further the scientific understanding of the Delta and build upon the principles of adaptive management and to support decision makers' needs. So in guiding this facilitation of best available science and promoting the application of adaptive management, the Delta Science Plan supports both the Delta Plan and the 2009 Delta Reform requirements. So the Delta Science Plan is also an element of a three-part Delta Science strategy, which was developed to achieve the vision of one Delta, one science, which I think is a phrase that you've probably heard of quite often. It means an open science community that works collaboratively to build a shared body of scientific knowledge to inform water and environmental decisions and ultimately support effective and robust management actions directed at balancing the co-equal goals. The Delta Science Plan was established, both the Delta Science strategy and the vision, but it's itself also a guiding document that identifies the tools, the mechanisms, and the organizational structures for more collaborative and integrated science. The other two elements of the Delta Science strategy, as you can see on the image to the left, are the State of Bay Delta Science, which summarizes what we've learned about the Delta in terms of science and the relevance it has to management needs. And then it also provides a context to update the Delta Science Plan. The other element is the Science Action Agenda, which identifies focused, action-oriented science needs to address key management issues and to also address the objectives that are identified in the Delta Science Plan, using the gaps highlighted in the State of A Delta Science as a guide. Both of these guidance documents were presented to you in 2017. So again, the initial Delta Science Plan set the vision of One Delta, One Science. It was also the first attempt to setting up approaches for achieving this vision and identified 6 objectives listed here to progress towards the vision and also actions to support these objectives. Both the Delta Stewardship Council and the Science Program have participated in and led several efforts that have continued to make progress on these objectives. And I'd like to go over just a few. So one of them is the 2014 Data Summit and the ensuing vision paper that was hosted by the Delta Stewardship Council. This has promoted transparency and coordination while also receiving credit for inspiring Assembly Bill 1755, or the Open and Transparent Water Data Act. The recent synthesis documents that the Council has coordinated on climate change, ecosystem stressors, and restoration issues have provided critical information for the Ecosystem Chapter Amendment. And again, the State of Bay Delta Science has provided critical summaries of scientific understanding to support management needs. The Delta Science Program and the Delta Independent Science Board have played key roles in building trust and credibility of science through facilitation of multiple independent scientific reviews of contentious projects. And lastly, the Science Program has continued their leadership in ensuring science is responsible to management, including the development of the Science Action Agenda, which has been used to identify topic areas for a number of solicitation, including the most recent joint solicitation with the Department of Fish and Wildlife with support from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, which please look forward to being discussed at a future council meeting. So again, the Delta Science Plan calls for an update every 5 years, and this really allows us to reflect on achievements, but also identify the remaining challenges and kind of look forward to areas that contribute to One Delta, One Science. So I want to emphasize that although the Science Program led the facilitation of the update, the Delta Science Plan is really intended to be owned and implemented by the broad Delta science community. And by the science community, I mean anyone who is involved in science in the Delta. So this ranges from stakeholders to agency and academic scientists to the public. To ensure this broad input, outreach was sought early on, beginning with collaborative groups. To receive high-level feedback on missing topics or areas that the science plan could be improved upon. And then more detailed input was received at the April 9 public workshop. So the photo here is a really great representation and a snapshot of the diversity of participants that were at the workshop. So you can see here there's individuals representing federal and state agencies to water contractors to local water agencies. All of this input was then included in a public draft that went out for public review, which was followed by input from the Delta Science Program's Scientific Advisory Committee, and then substantial recommendations, as John mentioned, from the Delta Independent Science Board. In November, a draft science plan was presented to the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee for their endorsement and continued implementation. The enthusiasm across the DPIC is expressed in the preamble, which includes their logos. And here, the DPIC expressed their commitment in promoting and investing in coordinated and collaborative efforts identified in the Delta Science Plan. So based on input from the public workshop, the public review, and guidance from the Scientific Advisory Committee and Delta Independent Science Board, new concepts and areas of emphasis were identified, and I'll highlight a few here. So as you know, the need to improve science governance is an ongoing issue, and the Council has played a lead role in this effort, including hosting the Data to Decisions series that was presented last summer. And the Delta Science Plan does not identify solutions, but it sets the path to promote further dialogue to improve science governance. The need to integrate the social sciences in the Delta has gotten a lot of traction, and it's actually a specific action in the science plan to set up a social science task force to guide the Delta and how to better integrate social sciences. And the Delta Science Program has taken a lead on coordinating this task force. Also, the need to develop topic-specific implementation plans to focus funding needs is mentioned in the science plan, but also elaborated on the funding white paper that Amanda and Vice Chair Fioriani and Jason presented to you right before. Ongoing efforts that support this include the Delta Smelt Science Plan and the Delta Smelt and Salmon Resiliency strategies. So while climate change was identified in the 2013 Delta Science Plan, it was only incorporated on the periphery, and so we really took note of the recommendations from the Delta Independent Science Board and highlighted climate change as really an integral part of all science and management efforts moving forward. The Delta Science Plan overall supports long-term thinking, and the Council is also playing a leadership role on this topic with the initiation of the Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment and the Adaptation Strategy, which was presented to you at the last meeting. So overall, the Science Plan has had 9 new actions, 5 new appendices, and 8 actions that were removed as they were considered completed or no longer relevant. So now that you have an understanding of the Delta Science Plan and the relevance to the Council, the Science Program would like to request the Council for your endorsement of the 2019 updated Delta Science Plan and its implementation. So once we have your endorsement, we will move forward with an implementation plan. But again, I do want to emphasize that the Delta Science Program will, participate in leading development of an implementation effort, but we really serve as more of the coordinating body, and it's really up to the Delta Science community to see that the science plan serves as a guide for strengthening science collaboration across agencies and organizations. So implementation examples include having the actions as part of future solicitations, having them part of collaborative group work plans. So for example, the Interagency Ecological Program Science Strategy, the Delta Regional Monitoring Program's annual work plan, and also utilizing existing groups or developing some subgroups to have solution-oriented dialogue. And I think Council Member Villegas, I like your point of really including this early input of local agencies as well, because the point is to have broad buy-in to support the science plan. Again, the funding white paper and the actions within it and the recommendations will really play a critical role in identifying the resources and mechanisms to implement the actions in the science plan. So with that, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yumi. Any questions from the council members? Ken.
Just, maybe this is for Randy about how do we link the effort on funding to the science plan, and if we're endorsing the process and the stakeholder process, and that this reflects the Delta science community, how can we link those two? Can we make a stronger statement?
Well, they're definitely linked, and the science, John would be better to answer this, but my layman's view is that the science plan establishes a structure, and work like the Science Funding Initiative adds details to that structure. So they're very much linked. And Amanda and I had this conversation with the Independent Science Board and with others who say we need a Delta science plan. Well, we're not going to develop the detail in the science plan that's going to address every issue. But they've done a great job of framing this and helping to guide the One Delta, One Science. But now we need the details on matters such as funding and governance and so on. So it's a great question, and there is a direct linkage.
And I wanted to add to that the funding paper is kind of a branch of Chapter 5 of the Science Plan, which is jointly implementing the Science Plan. And actually, Chapter 5, there's several actions in there, one that calls for a more topic-focused implementation plans, which are elaborated on the funding paper. The funding paper also takes a lot of actions from the science plan. So for example, coordinated monitoring, more solution-oriented dialogue amongst managers and scientists. So they're very, very closely related. And I think the purpose, I think, of the funding paper is really to help move forward the actions in the science plan.
There's a follow-up implementation plan that will be coming. So is that where we can maybe merge these two issues?
So we aren't going to write a specific implementation plan, but we are very cognizant of implementing the plan. I think most of the actions are written and are set up in a way so that it's pretty clear how they will be implemented. But then we are thinking about other issues, like especially funding, and as we roll out, we make the plan more available widely and roll it out, we will be thinking about how do we, not only the science program, but how do we engage others to take on it. If you look at the plan for each action item, there's a lead that's identified. So we'll be working with them to make sure that those are moving forward.
Okay. I misunderstood that when we were talking about that. So I'll move the staff recommendation.
Do we have a second for endorsing the science plan?
Second.
Thank you, Oscar. So moved. Oh, actually, is there any public comment? I'm sorry. No? Okay. And now the vote.
Weinberg, aye. Fiorini, aye.
Tatay and I.
Yeagas, aye.
Great.
So moved.
Well, thank you, Yumi, and thank you all for endorsing that. And I think it really is a major step. We've been working on the science plan. Actually, when I first interviewed, there was a question about what's your ideas about the science plan. That was part of the interview process of how do we update the plan. So it's exciting to see that we are here at this point and now we really will be pushing forward to make it happen.
They got free advice.
Okay, so now we can move on to the lead scientist report.
Great. Okay. So actually, the first item that we're going to talk about is there are questions and discussion around Delta smelt issues. So we wanted to come back to address those, and I'm going to ask Dr. Luis Conrad, to come up, who's our new Chief Deputy for Science for the Council and the leader for the science program. So welcome, Luis. And Luis has much more experience and knowledge about Delta smelt, so I'll give you some background issues, and then Luis will fill you in on some of the recent work that's been going on around Delta smelt here. There were specific questions about the use of captive Delta smelt. I want to highlight that really the use of captive Delta smelt is one tool of many within the Delta smelt resiliency plan, and actually there's within your binder or within the folder of updated materials that you got at the table today, there is a copy of the Delta smelt resiliency plan. Within that plan, there are 13 priority actions. And actually, Luis will give us an overview of some of those issues. The specific action of the captive rear Delta smelt population is within the action around the Rio Vista Research Station and Fish Technology Center. There's a proposal to develop that. And a key part of developing that as a fish technology center is providing for a better facility for developing and culturing Delta smelt. So that's where that fits into the resiliency strategy. There was also questions about the urgency and what the effort is towards addressing the challenges around Delta smelt. I think there is certainly a feeling of urgency. As you know, the recent surveys that have been done with Delta smelt, there's hardly any fish that are being captured. The current population estimate, based on those on the current sampling, is about 5,000 fish, down from hundreds of thousands of fish in previous decades. So enormous decline in the population and definitely enormous awareness that the resiliency strategy and all of the work towards implementing that really does highlight. Beyond the resiliency strategy, some recent efforts it was mentioned, that part of the science plan, we really are trying to promote the development of topic-specific science implementation efforts or science plans around specific issues. Towards that, the collaborative adaptive management team that the science program and the Stewardship Council participates in has recently just completed a science plan around Delta smelt. It's specifically focused on how do we address flow issues that affect Delta smelt, but there also is the promotion of using experimentation and using cultured fish as a way to evaluate flow experiments. One key part of the science plan that was promoted, or that was recently developed, is the idea of the timeliness of incorporating science into management decisions, and that given that the smelt, it's an annual fish, how do we take knowledge from this year and use it to improve actions and improve science for next year? And so there's really some thoughtful ideas about how do we turn that over more quickly so that we turn science into management much more quickly. And then separate from that, there's also the structured decision-making efforts that are ongoing, both the work that the science program and the council has been doing with the Bureau, as well as the collaborative and adaptive management team's effort on Delta smelt. And so both of those efforts are moving forward as well to think about how we incorporate science into resource decisions and funding decisions. And that structured decision-making incorporates specifically how to address Delta smelt issues. So with that background, I'm going to turn it over to Luis, and Luis can give you some more specific updates about some of the recent experiments and efforts around Delta smelt.
Thanks, John, and thanks for a little time here. I'm just going to talk about 2 of the actions. As John mentioned, there are 13. Some of them have received quite a bit of focus for implementation, and the ones I've chosen to look at today are the ones that very recently have some nice results to share. So the first one is about the Sassoon Marsh salinity control gates, which is the topic on that slide there. And I wanted to show you that just in case you didn't have a visual for where these gates are and what they look like. So they're located in Montezuma Slough, in the upstream side, in Sassoon Marsh. And these gates have been existing for decades. However, they're generally used in the fall for waterfowl management purposes. The idea with this action within the resiliency strategy is to operate them in the summer to reduce salinity in Sassoon Marsh. And that's important because in the summertime is when Delta smelter have a lot of habitat constriction. There isn't a lot of habitat that's available, especially that's in the proper salinity range. So these gates were a tool that was existing to operate them at a time of year when Delta smelt would need more low salinity habitat. In Sassoon Marsh, there's also high-quality food resources, more favorable water temperatures, and this provided access to some habitat that they otherwise wouldn't have had because it would be too salty. So in August of 2018, Department of Water Resources led the operation of these gates and did quite a bit of monitoring to look at the results, and showed that it was successful as we predicted, that the salinity would be reduced. And also very positively, the fisheries monitoring showed that during the time of the action, Delta smelt showed up and were captured in Sassoon Marsh. And so that was a really positive result, and all the other monitoring suggested that maybe they wouldn't have been there given what we have observed in previous years. So there are plans to continue this action in future years, and again, a good success story for providing a space for Delta smelt at a tough time of year. So the next action that I wanted to highlight is one that John has already started talking about a little bit. There's increasing conversation and dialogue about the possibility for a captive supplementation program. And one of the concerns about this is that, well, it wouldn't work. Delta smelt are so fragile that they wouldn't survive the transportation or release. And the way to address that is to actually try something. And so this effort is very recent, happened in January of this year. And Department of Water Resources, again with other agencies, devised a system of cages that you're seeing here that are deployed from the boat and then using a buoy system linked together, and where you're looking at, I believe, the Deepwater Ship Channel there, where they have deployed these cages. And much better than anyone expected. The fish survived quite well. Average survival across the cages was over 95%. So this told us that, yes, you can put delta smelt into a cage and in the wild, and they will survive at the life stage that they tried it, which was adults or near adults. So this is a great success story because it gives not only some hope that a captive supplementation program might be worth considering, but also that now we have this tool where you can successfully keep delta smelt in natural habitat and see what happens to them, what conditions are appropriate and what conditions might not be, and maybe also look at life stages that are appropriate for release. So those are the two success stories that I wanted to share, and happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Great. And before questions, I'll just finish up because there also were questions about regulatory constraints for the use of captive fish. And as Luis mentioned, currently the captive fish are being used. Actually, they were out probably in January when we were at our last meeting. And so that is being accommodated through existing permits. Probably what's limiting it is the number of fish that are available in terms of, I think now that people see that this is possible, that there probably will be many more requests and opportunities to use the smelt to test a wide range of other questions. In terms of using captive reared fish for supplementation of the existing population, there's still a number of questions around that, as Luis mentioned, like what life stage might they be able to survive at, where would you release them, and a number of questions. So before that is possible, the idea is to do additional caged experiments over the coming year or years and really fine-tune our understanding so that we can make use of them for supplementation, assuming that things continue to go forward. And I think that the regulatory agencies are aware of these, of course, these experiments, and see them as a way to reduce the uncertainty so that potentially there could be permits issued for supplementation in the coming years. So if anyone has questions, please.
Ken? Oh.
Well, first of all, just a comment. John, you triggered this with the lead scientist report when you talked about releasing captive smelt, and I got the sense that there were some that didn't think there was enough happening and that there was a lack of a sense of urgency about trying to save the smelt. And I appreciate you coming back to us and providing us factual information that would suggest that there is a sense of urgency and that there is a lot going on in terms of trying to identify how to improve conditions for smelt. And Louise, thanks for those two project explanations. That's very helpful.
Yeah, the discussion we had on that paper, it was urgent, a sense of urgency, and I think the letter we got from the ISB supports that there's a broad sense of urgency. But it was, at least for my part, it was, gee, if there's urgency, shouldn't we be doing an all of the above approach, which sounds like maybe there's more going on than we had realized. But the difference between a year and years when we're losing the fight, and we talked about regulatory obstacles, it's sort of, if you're doing all of the above, you got to be able to push on all of the above. So I think that is still a question I have is, gee, how do you, do we need to push harder on this tool in the toolbox? Because, the numbers are still, we may get good news, but, the question is, gee, are we still losing the fight? Are those numbers good enough to, sustain a sustainable population? And I know, John, you said this idea of taking lessons learned this year and implementing next year, but there's a process to that. I mean, is it the peer review process that slows it down? Or
Most
is it the
of that is
regulatory?
going on within CAMPT, that actually Luis also participates in, and CSAMP that I participate in. And so I think the current plan is to do some actions this year based on last year's results, right? I think there's likely to be a flow experiment if needed, and the salinity gates probably will be tested again or will be evaluated again if needed. So I think there is immediate, it's not as though we're waiting a long time. They're taking exactly what was learned last year, improving the actions for this coming year, and then moving forward.
Oh, so they're able to do that. There's not obstacles to
that is the plan with all of the resiliency strategy actions that are being implemented. So I think there's discussion now about using this new cage tool in Sassoon Marsh while they're operating the gates so that we get a better sense directly from the Delta smelt of how well this works. So that's one option moving forward.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of our role to encourage progress.
Yeah, so I think, I think there's definitely interest in these ongoing experiments, and I think, encouraging that goes forward is valuable. I think it is moving forward already.
So is DPIC a place to, support and encourage these kind of actions, or is that?
I guess you've got the smelt resiliency information. The question would be, what more do you want to do?
I don't know. I mean, it's. Do you feel like this is, there's nothing more to be done than what's being done?
Well, I guess my answer to that is that DPIC is aware of the urgency, and the DPIC agencies have in fact devoted resources to some of these efforts. For example, Department of Water Resources is a member of DPIC, and these were their, I don't know if the cages and the boats. Anyway, folks, the scientists of the various DPIC agencies are working together not only on the Delta smelt problem, but the salmon resiliency. And in terms of urgency and pushing science, I think from the policy level here, it's difficult for us to see how urgently the scientists are working every single day, since even before CalFed. Science has been trying to figure out what's going on in the Delta. And there's now so much data that the neural network you see in the Delta Science Plan is really heartening to me. And I guess one thing I would add is sometimes we get caught up in the scientific findings of the day. And one thing that I think our scientific community is moving toward is, in addition to focusing on what's going on with each of these species, with the Delta Science Plan and the One Delta, One Science, and now with the funding initiative, folks are beginning to realize that in the past we did these things organically. As I think it was Jason, someone said, something's happening over here, this is a problem, let's monitor it. But now that we've got, thanks to the leadership of folks who created this guiding document called the Delta Science Plan, we have a way of, it's framed up that we need to coordinate our efforts and take a more conscious, holistic approach. And that means to me, that means that we're learning about the Delta smelt, we're learning more about the salmon, we're learning more about how floodplains and our water operations either benefit or do not benefit these species, and we're moving toward a more ecosystem-based, more ecosystem function-based approach rather than, go save the smelt. Oh, now go save the salmon. Oh, let's do a biological opinion on the smelt. Oh, now we have a biological opinion on the salmon. And I am really excited that we are on the frontier of with these tools, with the science plan, with the funding initiative, with the awareness, with DPIC to begin to bring all the pieces together, figure out how the pieces are either fitting or not fitting and coordinating or not coordinating. So I agree with you, Ken, that there is urgency, and I do know that folks are aware of that urgency. But there's urgency on almost every front with the listed species and the species of concern, and we've got to move away from a species by species approach. And I think that the science plan and the leadership of our science program and DPIC and the funding initiative paper are moving us more and more toward that more holistic approach.
Yeah, and I think we're all in agreement with that, and the community seems to be. This issue came up in context of the paper John presented, pointing out there were regulatory obstacles, and the question was, does captive fish have to be a part of the solution to the smelt? And so, if there are no regulatory obstacles, then that's fine, but it came up in that context of, gee, there's a sense of urgency, we're losing the battle, there seems to be obstacles to one of the tools in the toolbox. Should the council, who, ultimately our charge is to restore that ecosystem and, ensure water supply reliability, should we do something in that process? Now, being someone who's been in the regulated community, I don't have absolute faith in the state bureaucracy to move quickly on regulatory issues. I think that's one of our roles, is to help them move. If there's not an issue, then there's not an issue. If there is an issue, it's just trying to find something where we can push to make progress. I think that was the whole point. We've got more information now. We understand it, but I'll kind of maintain my position that if there's regulatory obstacles to a solution, we should be talking about it and letting others know. If we don't think there are, and it's all under control and it's going to move, in an expeditious manner, then hey, good job. I don't, it gets back, and maybe this is a discussion for tomorrow's retreat, but it kind of gets back to, where do we put our energies? What are our priorities? What's our role?
Oscar, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first of all, thank you, Luis, for the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy for July 2016. I had no idea. In going through it very quickly, I'm very impressed. And as it says here in no particular order, there are a whole host of proposed actions, some of which sound really cool. I mean, there's some good stuff that's happening, and it sounds like you guys are pretty well moving along in terms of what actually can be done. And I think in part to what Ken started the conversation about availing ourselves of opportunities that might lend themselves to further some of the things that are already in here. I mean, I'm certainly one that is interested in sort of figuring out kind of, is this a forum to further some of the things that are in a proposed suite of near-term management actions that actually lay out a whole host of things that are in support of exactly what the conversation was at the last meeting. And so I think, for me at least, this gives me a very good understanding that there are things happening. And as you said, Madam Chair, we're not going to be able to probably dive deep into any particular one, but I think lending ourselves as an ear for opportunities that might lend themselves within our respective authority, I'm very comfortable with kind of where you're at, and I'm excited, and I think we need more baskets, right? I mean, that's the solution, right? Just keep the fish in the baskets, and they don't become predatory to anything else, and we're good. Bigger baskets, more of them. So.
I just want to say thank you for your appreciation. It is quite a bit of work among the scientific community to pull some of this off, and I think in a little bit in answer to your your statements that this advocacy and support for this kind of work is not insignificant coming from the council. So, so your support generally and public support is appreciated and helps to grease the skids, as it were, for continued action.
Good. All right. Thank you, Luis. Okay, so the remaining items, I did want to, I don't have any information specifically on the proposal solicitation that is currently out, but I did want to update you because there will be proposals coming to you for your review and adoption in April. And we are far along in the process, so we had over 62 proposals that were submitted that were considered both by the council as well as by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we've identified the proposals that we're planning to fund, and we're now working to get that set up so that we have a really strong mix of proposals that address the key actions within the science action agenda that really guided the proposal solicitation, and we'll be coming forward with those to you in April. So I encourage you to, when you get your update for next month, if you have questions about any of them, I'd be happy to talk with you in more detail about them, but it's a really strong mix of research that we will be able to fund. In terms of thinking about the continuity of funding, this is the first time we've funded a solicitation since 2011. We don't have funds to do it every year. Our hope is to, in terms of getting some continuity going, to have a solicitation like this every 2 years. But it's a major step forward that we were able to do that this year. So the remaining items I wanted to talk to you about very briefly, there is a paper that's summarized in my written report. The title is "The Changing Character of the California Sierra Nevada as a Natural Reservoir." This is a really interesting paper that highlights the use of climate models, of forecasting models to evaluate snowpack into the future. I chose it just because it really illustrates the use of these kinds of models to inform us for challenging management decisions currently and into the future. It highlights that if we continue at the current high emissions conditions, by 2100, there'll be an 80% reduction of snowpack throughout the Sierra, with even greater reduction in the northern part of the Sierra due to lower elevations, and that's where more of our water, our reservoir capacity is. So there will be dramatic and significant impacts, and even significant impacts not by 2100, but in the next 20 to 30 years, in terms of how that changing snowpack will affect reservoir management. So that's I think, interesting paper and connects to the climate change issue that the ISB highlighted. The two other items that are in the written report are just a summary of the Delta Social Science Task Force that the science program has been leading and that had its first kickoff meeting in January, and that Susan actually attended and gave you an update on, I think, at the February meeting. So there's some details there. Really, the focus of the Social Science Task Force is to develop a strategy for engaging social scientists and improving the level of effort that's going into social sciences within the Delta so that we can use that information as well as the natural science information that we have to address our issues and management challenges. And then the other recent event that we supported is the Adaptive Management Forum that also was a part of the original science plan. It was called for in the original science plan, and we had the first Adaptive Management Forum in February, a 2-day event that the science program hosted, but with a broad range of participation and outside speakers from across the country who came and talked about how adaptive management is working on invasive species in the Great Lakes, on Columbia River science management issues on the Missouri River, as well as some examples from the Delta. And the idea of the forum was to bring in some experts and to really educate practitioners about how adaptive management can be implemented, what's required in adaptive management plans as part of the Delta plan, and how we might move forward with a broader adaptive management plan or adaptive management approach across, not just for individual projects, but across the whole system. And the IAMIT, the Interagency Adaptive Management implementation team, I think. Their paper, their work was really featured as a key part of the discussion there. So any questions on either any of those events or the paper? Okay, so the last thing I wanted to do is to invite up Dr. Nir Oxenberg, who is our science communication expert at the science program, and Nir is going to give us an overview of the updates to the Delta Science Program's webpage that really is a critical outreach tool for us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, council members. Okay, good. Can you guys on your screen see the website? Wonderful. As John mentioned, the Delta Science Program web pages have been updated and redesigned. The science pages are some of the council's most interacted with pages. Because of their importance, we decided to fully revamp these pages to better reflect the mission of the Delta Science Program and the services that we provide. So the new pages are found under the Delta Science Program tab on the Delta Stewardship Council homepage. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to demo a few of the new features. This looks a little small, huh? Is that a little better? Great. So the new drop-down menu shows at a glimpse the services provided by the Delta Science Program and a few high-level documents that we create. The About the Science Program page highlights upcoming events and announcements and has a brief overview of the Delta Science Program's mission. I'll talk a little slower. Mission and the objectives of the Delta Science Program. Our new research funding and fellowships page provides an explanation of the research funding and opportunities that we provide, the research projects we are currently funding, and a database of previously funded research. Any projects funded through the recent proposal solicitation will later be added to this ongoing research page. For the first time, you could find information on past projects and search by keywords, funding type, or topic. For example, if you wanted to find all directed actions related to climate change and vegetation, you can now easily do so. The scientific peer review page has a description of the Delta Science Program's role in independent scientific peer review and advice, and a new search function to explore all previous reviews that were coordinated by the Delta Science Program. On the science synthesis page, you'll find a catalog of all current and past science synthesis projects, along with associated symposium workshops coordinated by the Delta Science Program. Our new adaptive management page has a description of our role in adaptive management, including a summary of the functions of adaptive management liaisons and how to get in touch with them. Our science communication page describes the types of events and publications we support to enhance science communication. And finally, we also have a page devoted to the Delta Science Strategy, which provides an explanation of the three-part strategy that includes the Delta Science Plan, the Science Action Agenda, and the State of Bay Delta Science, and how the Delta Science Strategy works towards the vision of One Delta, One Science. I encourage you to browse the pages and keep a lookout for new additions in the future, including our role in interagency coordination. Please reach out to us with any suggestions that would help serve you better. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you, Nir. Council members, any questions for Nir before he leaves?
Thanks,
Okay.
Nir. Okay, that concludes science report.
Great. Thanks, John. Are there any public comments? No? Okay. Well, at this point, I think we can take a 10-minute break, or roughly 10 minutes, be back by 2:15. We'll move on to agenda item 6 now, Executive Officer's Report.
Okay, good afternoon. I have a few announcements. As a reminder, based on council member discussion at our January 2019 meeting, the council will be convening again tomorrow to hold a retreat to discuss council authorities, responsibilities, and priorities in implementing the Delta Reform Act. The retreat will be held at the Crocker Art Museum in downtown Sacramento and begin at 9 a.m. It's open to the public, and the notice with agenda topics is available on our website. As part of the development of the council's public participation plan, staff have prepared a survey to assess council efforts to encourage public participation in our decision-making. The results of this survey will provide the background for a council workshop on public participation to take place later this year. In fact, the survey launches today and will be available through April 30th. And a laptop is available at the meeting services desk in the back where Brandon is waving for anyone in the public who would like to take the survey today. Included in your packet are a number of Delta Plan implementation and coordination letters, along with our February outreach highlights. I'm just going to quickly summarize the letters. In late February, the council staff sent a comment letter to the City of Sacramento regarding the notice of preparation for the city's 2040 General Plan Update and Climate Action Plan. The letter stated that the update may meet the definition of a covered action and outline Delta Plan policies that could apply. Staff also offered to meet and provide early consultation for the General Plan Update. Earlier this month, council staff provided a comment letter to the Department of Water Resources regarding the guidelines and solicitation package for the Riverine Stewardship Program. The program seeks to restore streams, creeks, and rivers and enhancing in the environment for fish, wildlife, and people. Proposed projects submitted through the program could be located in the Delta and be subject to the covered action process, hence the letter. Also in your packet, in a response to an interview with Mr. Tim Quinn, former Aqua Executive Director, who is now in his new capacity as a fellow at Stanford, he was interviewed in the Water in the West newsletter on the topic of conveyance in the Delta, so I penned a letter to him reminding him of the state's Delta Plan guidance on the matter and included our recently adopted Conveyance Storage and Operations Amendment and recommendations. Jerry Merrill, the former Deputy Secretary for Resources in California, who's currently with the Natural Heritage Institute, sent a letter to a group of state officials, including the council and members of the Delta Protection Commission and the Flood Board, with advice on planning for sea level rise in the Delta, specifically as it relates to new projects and how they should be regulated by the state. These comments are relevant to our climate change vulnerability assessment, our forthcoming climate change adaptation strategy, as well as current deliberations, which we will bring to you next month on our ecosystem amendment and how we guide state investments. And so we will be considering that accordingly. I'm happy to report that at a first glance, much of the advice which he ties to the direction of the Ocean Protection Council on sea level rise is already embedded in the Delta Plan. Finally, I'm proud to highlight the Nutria Pocket Guide that you have before you. There are copies available on the back table. After a flurry of coordination with multiple agencies, we printed 25,000 Nutria Pocket Guides this month. Over 14,000 guides have been distributed to requesting parties, and other state agencies are committed to printing more. The need for this pocket guide was vocalized in late 2018 when county agricultural commissioners expressed the need to the state for nutria outreach materials. The group requested a field-friendly identification guide that could be widely distributed to landowners, to field staff, and other interested members of the public. Because nutria closely resemble native mammals that occupy California waterways like otters, muskrats, and beavers, especially beavers, therefore proper identification is really important. The guide compares the physical features of nutria to native species and identifies who to contact if a nutria is spotted. And my special thanks to Rachel Klopfenstein and Brittany Young on our staff who really made this a reality.
I guess you could say positive identification is really important to the beavers.
Exactly. Exactly. In covered action news, we have no active covered actions now, so that's something. Small victories. In personnel announcements, Harriet Ross joins us as the Assistant Planning Director for the Planning and Performance Division. Harriet is in the audience. She brings over 20 years of land use, policy, and environmental planning experience, and she comes to us from Environmental Science Associates, where she was a community planning program manager. She holds a master's degree in urban planning from UCLA and 2 bachelor's degrees from UC Santa Barbara in environmental studies and geography, and we're so glad to have her. And next, I'd like to invite Ryan Stambra up for our legislative report.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members. I'd like to start my update by directing your attention to the list of bills in this month's binder. As you may recall, at the Judge Damrell's request, you'll notice that there is now a subset of measures at the beginning of the document marked bills of interest. This list of 10 or so measures will include bills that may be of particular interest to the Council based on a number of factors, including the bill directly references the Council and or impacts the Delta Reform Act. The bill addresses a current Council priority. The bill is of interest to the Chair and or a particular Council member. And the list may also include bills where the Council is able to provide a unique perspective, particularly one that may not otherwise be represented. Measures outside of the bills of interest category, which are currently defined as watch, are likely to touch on a particular Delta Plan topic, but may be more appropriately addressed by other state agencies, for example, drinking water and the State Water Board, for instance. Ultimately, however, advocacy on a specific bill is and remains at the discretion of the Council. Given the nature of the legislative process, I anticipate that this list will remain relatively fluid while serving as the basis for the bills that I intend to report on each month. With this new approach, I will very briefly walk through the bills that have been initially prioritized. AB 409 by Assemblymember Monique Limon and AB 839 by Assemblymember Kevin Mullen are both focused on climate adaptation, with AB 409 focused on providing grants for the state's agricultural sector, and AB 839 focused on the development of a statewide adaptation strategy, which would serve as the basis for subsequent funding and implementation. AB 489 by Assemblymember Mark Stone and AB 948 by Assemblymember Ash Kalra are both focused on flood control projects, and more specifically the state's cost share and eligible activities for such projects. While AB 948 is still in spot form, AB 489 would clarify the scope of recreational activities for non-federal flood control projects when determining the state's cost share for such a project. AB 912 by Assemblymember Al Marisucci deals with the management of ballast water and would, among other things, require applicable vessels to comply with a number of performance standards for ballast water discharge, including those developed by the State Lands Commission. As the Council will recall, untreated ballast water has resulted in the introduction of several non-native species and invasive aquatic plants in the Delta and throughout the state. AB 933 by Assemblymember Cotty Petrie Norris would establish the Ecosystem Resilience Program at the Department of Conservation with a focus on funding watershed coordinators who would assist with the implementation of locally developed watershed efforts. These efforts could include water quality monitoring, habitat restoration, invasive species removal. Given that these positions and associated activities have been historically funded in the past through various bonds, funding has been somewhat inconsistent, something the bill hopes to ultimately address. AB 1194 by Assemblymember Jim Frazier would increase the membership of this council to 13 members. In addition to current council construction, the bill would add 2 members with expertise in Delta agriculture and Delta small business, and 2 members appointed by a Delta Municipal Selection Committee, which would be formed as a result of this bill. In addition, 2 ex officio members would be added, which would include 1 member each from the Senate and Assembly, who represent areas of the primary zone. SB 19 by Senator Bill Dodd would require the Department of Water Resources and the State Water Board to develop a plan to deploy stream gauges in places whereas the bill states a lack of data contributes to conflicts in water management. While the bill is intended to apply statewide, the potential benefits to the Delta could certainly be meaningful. For instance, of the 500 stream gauges currently deployed by USGS statewide, 35 are in the Delta and are used to collect data on a number of variables like nutrients, salinity, and temperature. SB 45 by Senator Bill Allen is a wildfire, drought, and flood protection bond that would result in the issuance of bonds totaling a little over $4 billion for activities including wildfire suppression, habitat restoration, climate adaptation, and water quality protection. In order for this bond to appear on the 2020 ballot, a supermajority vote of both houses, as well as the governor's signature, will be necessary. And then the last bill I'd like to highlight is SB 204 by Senator Bill Dodd as well, which I've discussed in, I believe, last month, and which would augment the legislature's scope of review by adding water fix-related contracts to the legislative purview and add additional compliance criteria for long-term water supply contracts, which are currently subject to legislative review. As previously noted, SB 204 does not appear at this time to actually provide the legislature with approval authority over either contract type. And then moving on to recent news regarding the National Flood Insurance Program, where the Trump administration recently announced its proposal to transition flood insurance premiums from subsidized rates to actuarial rates that would be reflective of actual flood risk for individual parcels. While this could certainly help address the ongoing insolvency of the flood insurance program, it would also significantly increase flood insurance premiums for thousands of people nationwide, including Delta residents. And then finally this morning, with the President's signing of Senator Lisa Murkowski's S-47 earlier this month, the Delta as a designated national heritage area, the first in California, is now a reality. The NHA designation is a key recommendation in the Delta Plan and something the Council has historically supported through a variety of means, including staff support, just as recently from the Council's previous fellow, Seth Yund. And with that, Madam Chair, that concludes my report. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ryan. Any questions from the Council? Ken?
Great report, Ryan. One question, AB 834, this freshwater and estuarine harmful algal bloom program. So is this, I mean, we had some legislation last year, I can't remember, I mean, we talked about, you know, that what our role is or the science program's role. So this sounds like it establishes a program and, you know, maybe is this a first step to getting money into responding to algal blooms? It sounds like it's statewide, which would include the Delta. Mm-hmm. So any insight on this one?
I would say it's certainly an attempt to be a little bit more focused on on addressing the issue by specifically identifying the State Water Board as kind of the sole overseer of such a program. I think that's certainly the intent. Once established, then certainly funding, I think, would be the next step. But I'd certainly be happy to look into that a little bit further and provide you some more information.
Remember, I think last year it was like forming a task force, and so this seems to be the next step down the road. Okay.
Certainly.
Thanks.
Well, to piggyback on the National Heritage designation, I want to compliment the Delta Protection Commission, Oscar. It's been a joint effort with our agencies, and I am particularly pleased that Seth Yund, who Ryan mentioned in passing, who is our executive fellow, we always like to task the executive fellows with a project or two that they can point to as something that they have done, and that designation pursuit was one of his, was in his job description. And he and Blake in your office really worked hard to identify other areas around the country that had a similar request or need. And I think part of the reason this was successful is that there was a nationwide support for a number of these National Heritage designation approvals. So congratulations to both of our agencies.
Now the hard work begins.
Okay, any further questions? Any public comment? No. Thank you, Ryan.
That concludes my executive officer's report.
Thanks, Jessica. Now on to file item 7, the 5-year review of the Delta Plan. Stakeholder assessment.
Okay, as Andrew and Lisa make their way up to the table, I'm just going to say a few words to frame this up. The Reform Act requires that the Council review the Delta Plan every 5 years and amend it as it deems appropriate. And to that end, we launched a formal effort to review the plan, and as part of that, we gathered a group of stakeholders, agency representatives, and others who frequently interact with the Council and its plan for interviews. The 5-year review is not an update to the plan itself, but rather will create a roadmap for future updates and Council priorities. Also, it's a time to reflect on implementation of the plan, what has worked, and what can be changed or improved. We originally intended to conduct these interviews last year, but were faced with the reality of ex parte communication restrictions, which would have, I think, reduced the quality of the conversations. And so, and then as we began the interviews, there was a federal government shutdown, which required the rescheduling of some of the participants. But we're pleased to bring to you today the summary of what we heard. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairperson, council members. Thank you. So today's discussion, as Jessica alluded to, we're going to be going over just a quick review and update on our progress on the 5-year review. And then the majority of this presentation will be Lisa providing you with some of the highlights of the stakeholder assessment that we've just conducted. Lisa is an extremely experienced facilitator and communicator in the Delta water or in the California water community. Has done a tremendous amount of work on the California Water Plan and a number of other efforts, and really knows all the folks in this industry, and was a great person to be out conducting these interviews. We did intentionally want to have a third party conduct these interviews so we would get unbridled, unvarnished feedback. And then we'll leave some time for discussion and feedback from you all, of course. So just as a review, the Water Code actually mandates why we are doing this 5-year review. Section 85-300C says that every 5 years we need to review and we may revise as necessary the Delta plan. So with 5 years of experience under our belt, 18 covered actions, 2 appeals, now is a great time to go back and take stock of what we've learned and really set a roadmap for where we go over the next 5 years and what future changes to the plan and its implementation really need to look like. So what we're going to be doing is really reflecting on the written plan and our initial efforts, and we'll identify areas of the plan that could be reinforced, that could be clarified, streamlined to make easier implementation or easier, smoother covered action process, or areas of the plan that need to be expanded or improved. And then with your help, we will prioritize actions and put together an implementation time frame for what we find. I want to reiterate, as Jessica said, that the 5-year review will not include any amendments or changes to the plan. We will just be highlighting issues and setting them up as options for how we might go about addressing those issues and then setting the implementation priorities and time frame. So just a real quick review of our process. Back in May, staff briefed the council on an initial staff assessment that we had done of the Delta plan. We've also conducted reviews with sister agencies and a survey of the DPIC on the administrative performance measures. We recently just completed our external evaluation of the plan. That's what we'll be focusing on today. And then also ongoing in the background, we have been assessing the Delta Plan covered action process among staff and among folks that have been engaged with that process. And we have been conducting additional assessment and analysis of the Delta Plan and implementation activities. And so we'll be putting all of that together over the next few months and delivering 2 reports out of this effort, a highlights report and a recommendations report. The highlights report will really describe major accomplishments during the initial 5 years of the implementation of the Delta Plan and identify anticipated policy and management challenges that we see coming over the next 5 to 10 years. And that will be similar in format to an annual report that you're familiar with. The recommendations report will summarize the results and review of the Delta Plan, describe the strengths and successes of the Delta Plan and the areas where the plan could be improved, expanded or streamlined, and discuss implementation opportunities and challenges and recommend priority actions to address these opportunities and challenges. And the report will be useful to the council in setting staff priorities and work plans into the future. The high-level outline of that recommendations report was provided in the staff report. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Lisa to tell you what you really want to hear.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and councilors. My name is Lisa Butler, and I'm very happy to be here with Andrew today. One of the things that Andrew mentioned is the staff had started a process to evaluate the 5-year review, and in that process determined that it would be important to check in with stakeholders and get that sort of external perspective in addition to the normal good staff work that they would do in a technical review. With that, they asked me to help them pull together some interviews, some focus groups. We also put together a survey, and we were able to go out and talk with the Delta Protection Advisory Committee at one of their public meetings. We had a little workshop session with them. So I had a really nice opportunity to talk to people and had a lot of different ways of getting information. We conducted the survey, as mentioned, and the input process from December 31st through February 13th of this year. And one of the things that we did was provide project definitions, an overview of the process, and background information that would help people be familiar with the terms that we were going to use, as well as what the actual 5-year plan included. And one of the documents, by the way, was very well received, and we were asked by one of the agencies if they could use that as a handout in their own processes. We conducted 31 different specific interviews, which included 83 individuals. Most of the interviews lasted about a half an hour to an hour and a half and included 17 questions. We were able to reach a number of different sectors, and you can kind of see from the presentation, folks that are really engaged with the Delta, really care about it, were all brought into the conversation. By the numbers, we also did the survey. We did a very wide survey distribution. Well over 5,000 people received links to respond to it. We did get 124 respondents for the 18 questions. That's a long survey for an online survey, and we did alert people. We actually gave them an off-ramp so they could just respond to the partial survey. They didn't have to complete the whole thing. Looks like we're stuck. There we go. So in terms of the survey, overall, you can look at the percentages a little bit later, but overall, they mostly represented people that worked or lived in the Delta, had a relationship with the Delta. There was a subset that was not, but overall, that was the largest majority of responses. The outreach topics that we talked about, we started out with some general demographics to understand who we were connecting with. We asked how they felt that the Delta plan would align with the work that they did. We wanted to know what people's expectations were for the review, how successful that they thought the Delta plan had been, what barriers people were experiencing. We also wanted to know how well people understood the council roles and authorities. Additional questions considered the performance measures of the Delta plan, best available science, adaptive management, DPEC, and asked people for suggestions for improvement. So, with regards to expectations, one of the things that people said that the Delta Plan review should do is set the stage, tell people the story of where you've been and what's happened in the last 5 years. They said you should talk about the stressors and explain to people how significant this task is and how bringing the Delta to health would not be an easy process. They really emphasized how important it would be to consider climate change and how much climate change our understanding of that may have even changed in the last 5 years and the implications of that for the planning process. An interesting factor, and this was something that I spent quite a bit of time talking to staff about, was the emphasis that many of the respondents made on governance and institutions. Several people, especially people who worked a lot with policy, pointed out that this was a very significant change in the way government had ever worked before, and that this rearrangement of the Delta agencies had significant social and sort of behavioral implications. So there was a lot of interest in, did that work, and is this a pattern or a method that could be used for other kinds of processes? One thing that came up, I always say about half of the respondents, was the importance of celebrating success. They said, you know, there have been some good things that happen, and it's been 5 years, and maybe you don't see a lot of progress, but you have done some good stuff. Just even still existing 5 years later, that's actually a quote. You're still here 5 years later. That's room for success. And there was sort of a tension, there was a balancing of how people were responding to things. Everyone acknowledged that in 5 years, it was probably not even realistic to talk about what progress would look like. But they said there was a way of understanding that that did not indicate failure. Other people said, well, you haven't made much progress. Maybe you ought to look at doing something different. And that was about half and half. So you'll see that scale not tilt in one way or another. In terms of the co-equal goals, we found that there was significant divergence in the way people thought about them, and this could be predicted by who the respondent was. So in our demographics, there were certain sectors that had stronger opinions and how they felt that that would work. In each case, they were able to point out where they thought the tension existed. So for example, how are we doing with the co-equal goals, and when you're looking at conveyance, say, versus ecosystem goals? We heard about the complexity of all of this stuff and how it was difficult to get your arms around it. And were there conflicts between agricultural and the ecosystem, or agricultural and conveyance? And those were all weighed into how does that look with a co-equal goal process. And then finally, something that came out with a particular group of the respondents was, Is this really co-equal goals, or should this be tri-equal goals? The goals are often discussed about as one thing and another thing, but in fact it's supposed to be in the context of a delta as an evolving place. And the failure to have it represented in the language they felt was a flaw. We asked people what would get in the way of the plan being successful. They said that the social dynamics could not be overlooked, that there is a long history of things that have happened before now, and that people simply could not come into a process and ignore what that history looked like. So that we really needed to work on the social construct for this, and that those dynamics would continue to contribute to conflict. Other people felt that pure understanding of what things were, for example, they found that EcoStore is very difficult to understand, particularly if you're not a technical person. So do people even know what we're talking about when we're presenting these ideas? Some people found that it wasn't really clear what the objective was. What does it look like? What is the vision for a healthy delta? And they didn't believe that was articulated in a way that they would be able to restate it or know whether or not you had been successful. Getting back to definitions, what does reduced reliance mean? They mentioned that they felt it would be difficult to measure implementation, particularly since the council itself does not own the actions. Things are happening with other agencies that the council does not have control over. And finally, people said you should really look at how do you move forward. We have this big context of how things are occurring. And until we resolve getting over all those hurdles with other agencies and jurisdictions, that it would be difficult to be successful. Some additional things that are probably not surprising to you would be jurisdictional conflicts. This is just around planning agencies and what people perceived as the things that belong to them. Once again, heard it over and over again, language, terminology, phrases without definition. Water rates was raised by some individuals, local planning, agency inclusion, and then finally, almost to a person, people talked about funding. There was not sufficient funding to do things that people felt needed to happen. We asked questions about best available science and how people felt that was working. Generally speaking, we had very, very positive perspectives about the science program. We really didn't receive complaints. The kinds of criticisms just had to do with the way that things were happening. People felt the most important feature of the science program was independence. They did think that some people felt that there was more room for better alignment of the science program with decision making. They felt that the science panel being independent was very, very important, and also if decision making and studies were not really following the kind of work that the Delta needed, that was somewhat problematic. Other people felt that it would be possible to have a better outcome with the science program if there was more alignment with agency science, maybe more of a master plan so people could be additive rather than in conflict with the things that they were working on. This was before you started the social science piece, but several people mentioned the importance of social science in terms of overall understanding. And another thing that was brought forward was the idea of traditional ecological knowledge, which is something that a lot of agencies are starting to pull in. This is historic knowledge from which particularly tribal people have a lot of experience and knowledge about. And once again, funding. Yes?
Could you go back to the previous slide?
Sure.
Maybe explain to us a little more about best available science needing to be in alignment with agency science, because that sounds like agency, and who is the agency science, and who is, suggesting that agency science isn't aligned with best available science, which is the purpose of our science program.
Right. The reference for that had to do with the actual planning and the way that when and what was being studied. It wasn't the findings of the science. So there was a perception by some, and by the way, this is just different individuals making these comments, but there was a perception by some that the agency science programs were just kind of going off doing their own thing, and you could maybe get more bang for your buck if there was a better alignment or planning around the kind of science that was being researched and the things that people were looking at. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm trying to relate it to the earlier item we had on the science white paper on funding that Randy led. Yeah, just, first I mean, we are the hub of best available science, and the agencies are looking to us. So this sounds like could be you're not drawing the conclusions I want you to draw, or you're not studying the things I want
I think
you
it
to
was
study.
more like I'd rather you be studying things that were more additive to the things rather. It wasn't so much the outcomes, but more about can we plan our science in such a way that we get more bang for our buck.
Okay.
That was the tone of it.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, we're hearing a lot of that.
Okay. Well, good. I'm glad that we're saying things that are consistent. Great. So in terms of adaptive management, everyone felt that was the way to go. There were a couple things people raised about it, though. One of them was implementation, and this just had to know with understanding what was actually going to be, what would meet the test, what needed to be brought forward. Also, it came up, especially with the local agencies. This adaptive management thing, it's great in concept, but basically what you're asking me to do is spend money, and I don't know if it's going to work. So you're going out there and go pilot this, try this, do this. We're going to test it for a while. I might have to go back to my ratepayers and explain to them that I just spent money on something that I'm going to have to redo in 5 years. So overall, once again, people absolutely felt it was important to do this, yet that was a big commitment people felt to ask of their ratepayers. So we wanted to have also better understand what people thought about the regulatory authority. Did they actually understand it? Did they understand the covered action process? And what we found was, generally speaking, it just depended on whether or not someone would actually be subject to it. So if you weren't part of that process, you probably didn't know much about it, and a lot of people said they didn't. Whereas the agencies, particularly local agencies, they had strong opinions about it. In terms of the views, once again, there was conflicting views. Some people felt that the agency, that the Delta Stewardship Council should have much more authority, that they shouldn't be reviewing things, but in fact deriving things, that the hammer should also include a carrot, those kinds of things. There were others that questioned whether or not the council should even have their nose in business that they perceive that they are better suited to make decisions about. So I noticed smiles, so I'm sure you know probably who said those things.
I think your quote when we went over this material earlier was, "I understand why you need to regulate that guy's project, not mine."
That was pretty much, that's an excellent summation of the conversation. They had very specific examples. It's like, I'm building a marina, for heaven's sakes, or, what do you guys know about levees? So that was those kinds of comments. But that covered action, the water fix, yeah, you definitely should be looking at that. So once again, performance measures, and staff's already on top of this when they've started working on making them more transparent so people could access them and even understand what they are. People that are familiar with the performance measures pointed out that there were some factors about it that made them hard to track. One of them is the level of performance measures. Some of them are process measures. Some of them are outcome measures. Some of them are easier to measure, and so on and so forth. Also, timeframes are difficult, particularly in a 5-year review process. So they were really fairly technical things. These will be things that I can spend more time with staff when they're preparing their actual review process, and I know that they are working on that. We asked about DPIC. I noticed that you'd asked about that a little bit earlier. Most people found there was great promise for DPIC, but maybe not the level of outcome that they had hoped for. I heard so many comments about your leadership member, Fiorina. It was, many people said you had really made that work, that the things that had happened there, they attributed to you particularly and indirectly. We heard the meeting. No, that was the part about how they felt that you had really kept it together, that you tried to bring very relevant information to the process. There were many, many compliments about your leadership of the group. So I wanted to make sure that was acknowledged, that the lower performance was not related to anything that you did. The meeting frequency was considered to be a problem. There were also structural executives where some of the people had started sending second-tier staff, further down in the organizational chart, and that they also. Many people mentioned that they felt an executive had maybe made a commitment, but somehow that just was not getting down to the level of implementation. And there was some suggestion that maybe that was just a lack of communication. Other people felt that was maybe just sort of an inherent sort of static situation inside of an agency. So that wasn't known what that cause was. And then finally, for these agencies, they all have their own missions. And that was something that really had to be taken into account when you were asking them to look at your stuff.
For clarity, when you say meeting frequency was a problem?
They felt that probably people were not together enough to really create the kinds of relationships that were needed. They also felt that it might make more sense for the kind of working topics to go to working staff rather. So are these the right people for this particular conversation? Over and over and over, people talked to us about climate change, the understanding of the climate change. This was just an overarching theme, and how people perceived that this would change what needed to be considered, and the urgency of what you were trying to do. We did hear a lot about governance. Many people felt, and these are conversations you are familiar with, that they were not really adequately represented in this process, especially folks that were from Delta locations, didn't believe that just with one representative physically from the Delta Protection Commission in particular, that probably didn't allow the kind of representation they felt they should have. That spoke also to their understanding of how they receive materials and things like that. I think that the public outreach survey you're doing will help with some of that. But it wasn't just Delta folks. We heard from the disadvantaged community, environmental justice community, that perhaps the thought that they were being represented in some way in this process was somewhat lacking. Tribes also brought this issue up, that this was a concern for them. The issue of accessibility was one that relates to the fact that some of the language that is used, and that's not just English versus a different language, but also technical language. It's not readily accessible to the regular reader, to a person who's just not doing this every day and not a water wonk. So there really needed to be bigger emphasis on making things so people could get to them easier and understand them. In terms of the survey, we just wanted to note that the survey responses largely mirrored the information that we received from the interview process. There was really a difference in the respondents. So the people that were interviewed were known and selected as people with a lot of familiarity with one or more of the Delta Plan issues or processes. The survey was open to anyone. One of our questions had to do with how much do you know about the Delta Plan? Many people told us they really didn't know very much about it, but they knew a lot about the co-equal goals, and they had a lot of opinions about how things were going with the co-equal goals. So we received a lot of feedback relative to that, and it's, again, things that would probably be intuitive to you that you might hear. With that, when we talked to staff about this, one of the things that we really noted was, especially with people telling us, and at least half the people who responded said, I don't know really anything about the Delta Plan. So when they gave comments, the Delta Stewardship Council is really a proxy for how people understand all things Delta. And most people in the public don't. There are so many Delta agencies, truly, how would anyone keep track, right? So whatever your interface is with the Delta process or an agency, in this survey, that was information that showed up. People were saying, here's how I feel about things Delta generally. And I think that's a great piece of feedback, too, just to understand that when you're in these conversations, we have to be careful how we assess what we're hearing. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but over and over, I heard very nice things about staff, and I heard very nice things about the leadership of the council. And everyone talked about how professional staff were and how much they appreciated when people would work with them. Just a very high quality of interaction. So with that, I'm going to turn this back.
Yeah. So Just to sum up a few things, so Lisa brought forward just a lot of issues that we heard. Some of these issues may be broader than what we can handle in this 5-year review, and I just want to highlight that there are a lot of other activities already going on with council staff that align with much of the feedback that we heard, and that will provide opportunities to deal with and address some of these issues in the future. So the structure and focus of the science program, you just heard about the Delta Science Plan update. So that is in the works and already kind of moving forward. Issues around general public awareness related to the council processes and roles. We have a public participation and outreach plan that we're working on that is underway. And then with climate change, last month you heard about the climate change vulnerability assessment work that's already begun and will be moving forward. So with that, I will conclude our remarks and open it up for the council. We do plan on coming back roughly once a quarter for the rest of the year with updates and progress to get to, I believe, November, when we will have a final report. Is our schedule now.
Great. Thank you both. Any questions for our panelists? I have a question. Did anyone offer specifics on what they would change in the Delta plan?
No, it was very interesting. And we specifically asked, we had a question that specifically asked, what part of the plan do you think we would change? What should we look at to do differently? The folks that had ideas mentioned that they felt the amendments had already been going through or had just occurred. So there were things that people had thought should have be changed, and they felt that council was addressing it. So, and it was a specific question. And I think that was something that came up when I talked to staff too. They're like, people really, we were really looking for that because that would give some guidance to staff, but that wasn't really what we heard.
Any comments from the public? Yeah, I have. Is Emily Papala? Could you pronounce your name? Papalardo.
You're on the right track.
Okay.
Well, thank you. There we go. All right. Well, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to provide some comment, and thank you, Lisa and Andrew, for doing this study. I just wanted to reinforce a comment about best available science and using the latest and greatest science for the Delta. Kind of looking back at a Delta Independent Science Board levy workshop in 2016, there was discussion on earthquake and high water hazards. And to quote a document from that workshop, major risk assessments have used available data on these hazards without mandates to advance science. And that hazards are earthquake and high water. So the DREAMS report has informed many studies in the Delta, and in particular, the Delta Levy investment strategy. But what we've found, or what has happened, is more recent studies have shown that earthquakes in the DREAMS report and the ground motions associated with those were much higher than actually could occur in the Delta. And so we want to see that reflected into the future on policies that inform levy improvements in the Delta Levy investment strategy especially. So as we advance science in the Delta, I would like to suggest promoting a Delta-wide hydrodynamic study. There's areas that we've even seen in the northeast Delta that can impact water quality. And so it'd be good to see what other districts may impact water quality and how far that extends up into the Delta. So just a couple of comments. I think that's all I had, was just about best available science, and thank you again.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you both. So are there any public comments on any items in the agenda that we've covered today? None. Okay. Well, as Jessica said, tomorrow we'll be having our council working session, and then the next meeting of the council will be at Park Tower Plaza, April 25. Thank you for coming.